There is a moment near the end of an early episode of Season 2 where Rick Sanchez, the smartest man in the universe, sits alone in his garage in the dark and builds a machine designed to kill him. He does not rage, he does not explain. He tears up. He puts a small suffering creature out of its misery first, and then he leans his own head into the path of the beam, and the only reason he is alive the next morning is that he passes out before the machine fires. That is the hero of this story. And the thing I keep turning over tonight is a strange one, because the more of Rick and Morty you watch, the harder it becomes to avoid. What if the villain of the whole series has been the main character the entire time? Not a twist, not a fan theory, but the thing the writers have been quietly telling us since the very first episode. So get comfortable, turn the lights down low, and if you have not subscribed to Paper Town yet, it really does help us keep making these. Let us go through all of it, slowly. Start with the word itself, because it matters. When people talk about a villain, they usually mean someone who wants a bad thing and chases it, and stands opposite a hero who wants a good thing. That is the clean version, the one you get in most cartoons and most comic books, where the man in the dark coat twirls something and the man in the bright suit stops him. Rick and Morty does not work like that, and it never has. There is no dark coat. There is a grandfather in a lab coat with drool on his chin, who happens to be the cleverest being alive, and he is the person we follow, the person we are asked to like, the person whose name comes first in the title. And yet, if you make a list of the things he actually does across the run, and you strip away the fact that he is charming and funny and the camera loves him, that list reads like a rap sheet. He has poisoned a planet and walked away from it. He has used a child as a shield. He has, while blackout drunk, murdered a room full of people and forgotten it by breakfast. He has engineered his own family's divorce so that he could be the most important man in the house. And the writers know all of this. That is the part that separates Rick and Morty from 100 other cartoons about a wacky scientist. Nobody here is accidentally making the lead look bad. The argument is being made on purpose. The clearest voice on this is not a fan or a critic. It is Dan Harmon, the co-creator and showrunner, who has said in interviews over the years, in different words at different times, that Rick is not a healthy person and should not be read as a hero. He has framed the whole design of the character around a simple test. If you find yourself in a situation and you have to stop and ask whether you are the bad guy, then you already have your answer, because good people do not have to check. Rick lives inside that question. He is written, deliberately, as what people who study stories sometimes call a villain protagonist, a lead you follow not because he is good, but because he is compelling, and the discomfort of following him is the entire point. When the series is working at its best, you laugh at something Rick does, and then a beat later you feel the floor drop out from under the laugh, because you realize what you were actually laughing at. Here is the honest complication, and I want to be fair to it before we go any further, because the title of this video makes a strong claim, and a strong claim deserves an honest hearing. Rick is not a villain in the cartoon sense of wanting the world to burn. He is not Rick Prime, the version of himself we will get to later, who kills without a flicker of feeling. Our Rick loves his grandson, in a broken and possessive way, but he loves him. He has, on rare occasions, done something genuinely selfless and paid a real price for it. So when I say Rick is the villain of his own show, I do not mean he is handed a black hat and a menacing theme. I mean something more specific and, I think, more interesting. I mean that if you look at who causes the most suffering across this series, who breaks the most things that cannot be fixed, who leaves the most bodies and the most wreckage in his wake, the answer is not some outside threat that the family has to survive. The answer is the man at the center of the family. The call, as the old line goes, is coming from inside the house. That is the reading, and Rick and Morty keeps handing you evidence for it, and almost nobody frames it out loud, so tonight we will. There is one more thing to establish before we walk through the evidence, and it is the piece that makes the whole argument land instead of just sounding clever. Rick is not only the villain of the story that happens to other people, he is the villain of the story that happens to himself. The greatest damage in Rick's life was done to Rick, by Rick, over and over, for decades. He built the walls of his own prison. He curated the universe he claims to hate. The depression that hangs over every season is not something the world did to him. It is a wound he keeps reopening, because healing it would mean becoming a smaller, quieter, less powerful man, and he would rather be miserable and godlike than well and ordinary. So when we say villain, hold both meanings at once. The person Rick hurts most is everyone around him, and also the person Rick hurts most is Rick. Keep that doubled idea in your mind as we go, because every chapter tonight is going to touch one edge of it or the other. To understand any villain, you have to understand the wound, and Rick's wound is the engine underneath everything, so we start there, in the deep past, in a version of the man the writers kept hidden from us for years. For a long time, Rick had no origin at all. That was part of the joke and part of the mystique. He arrived in the first episode already fully formed, already brilliant, already drunk, already treating the fabric of reality like a thing he was bored of, and the story refused to explain how a person becomes that. Then, slowly, across the middle seasons, it started to show us, and the picture it painted was not the one anyone expected. The origin of the most dangerous man in the multiverse is a love story, and the reason he is dangerous is that the love story ended in a murder. In the Season 3 premiere, the episode where Rick breaks himself out of a galactic prison, we get the first version of the flashback. We see a younger Rick in a modest home, a Rick who has not yet cracked the secret of traveling between universes, a Rick with a wife named Diane and a baby daughter named Beth. In this memory, another Rick, a stranger wearing his own face, appears and offers him the multiverse, the infinite fan of realities, the whole toy chest. And this younger Rick says no. That is the detail that reorganizes everything you thought you knew about him. The man who becomes the most restless, most contemptuous, most impossible to satisfy being in existence once stood at the door of infinity and turned it down, because he had a family and he wanted to stay with them. The stranger did not take the refusal well. He planted a bomb, and the bomb killed Diane and it killed the baby, and it burned the house. And the man who survived that morning was no longer the man who had said no. Now the writers play a careful trick with this memory the first time you see it, and the trick matters, because it is the kind of thing viewers rightly go back and check. In that Season 3 premiere, Rick is narrating the flashback to his captors as a way of stalling and manipulating them, and at the end he sneers that the whole thing was fabricated, a sob story he made up to buy himself time. For a couple of years, that left the tragedy hanging in doubt. Maybe there was no Diane, maybe it was a con. The ambiguity was allowed to sit, which is very Rick, refusing to let even the audience get a clean emotional hold on him. And then, in the Season 5 finale, the ambiguity closed. The tragedy is real. Diane and the infant Beth really were murdered. The only thing Rick had lied about, back in that prison, was a technical detail, the formula he claimed to reveal, which was the lie he used to escape. The grief underneath was true the whole time. He weaponized his own dead wife as a bargaining chip and then told the room it was fake, which tells you almost everything about how this man handles the one real thing in his life. He does not protect it. He uses it, and then he spits on it so nobody can use it against him. The man who set the bomb is a version of Rick the fans, and eventually the writers came to call Rick Prime, and he becomes the closest thing this series has to a traditional arch-nemesis. But we will come back to him properly later, because his role in the argument is not just that he is the bad guy. His role is that he is the mirror. For now, hold on to the shape of the origin. A brilliant man loses the only people he loves to a colder, crueler version of himself. And in his grief, he does not become gentle, he does not withdraw, he does not build something in their memory. He builds a gun that can open a door to every reality that exists, and he sets out across infinity to find and kill the thing that took them. Everything Rick becomes, all the travel, all the power, all the contempt for a universe that let this happen, grows out of that single morning. The portal gun, the object that defines the entire series, is a revenge weapon. We tend to forget that, because by the time we meet him, it is just his car keys, just the thing he uses to drag Morty somewhere insane. But it was forged in grief and pointed at a murderer, and it turned a grieving husband into a god. And here is where the villainy begins, because grief is not villainy. Grief is just pain. What turns Rick's pain into something that damages everyone near him is the shape his response takes. A person can lose everything and become kinder. Rick lost everything and became a man who decided the universe itself was the enemy, that meaning was a lie, that caring was a weakness that had gotten his family killed, and that the only rational posture left to a smart enough person was to feel nothing and travel forever. That is a choice, even if he would never call it one. He chose the coldness. He built a philosophy out of the coldness so that he would never have to feel the morning of the bomb again. And the tragedy, the reason this is a villain's story and not just a sad one, is that the philosophy did not save him. It just gave him permission to keep hurting people while telling himself that nothing he did could matter. Because nothing matters. Because he decided nothing matters. Because the alternative was unbearable. Hold that, because we are going to watch it play out at the scale of whole planets next. The clearest early proof that Rick is a different kind of protagonist arrives in the 6th episode of the very first season, and a lot of longtime fans point to it as the moment they understood this was not going to be what it looked like. On the surface, it is a simple setup. Morty has a crush on a girl at school named Jessica, and he begs his grandfather for help, and Rick, annoyed but willing, whips up a serum that will make her fall for him. It is a love potion. It is the oldest, silliest, most harmless premise a cartoon can run with. And then it goes wrong in a way no cartoon usually allows. Because the serum works too well, and then it jumps species, and then it spreads, and by the end of the episode, the entire population of Earth, every human being on the planet, has been mutated into writhing, fused, screaming lumps of flesh that fans came to call Cronenbergs, after the director whose films they resemble. Rick tries to fix it. He fails. He tries again. He fails again. And then he arrives at the solution that tells you exactly who he is. His fix is not to cure the world. His fix is to give up on the world. He scans across the infinite realities for a version of Earth where the exact same disaster happened, but where, crucially, that reality's own Rick and Morty managed to die in a lab accident right afterward, leaving 2 empty slots in an otherwise identical family. And then he opens a portal and he walks his grandson into that dead world, and the two of them find the corpses of the other Rick and the other Morty, and they bury them in the backyard. Morty digs a grave and lowers a body that has his own face into it and covers it with dirt. From that moment on, this new Earth, this borrowed Earth, is the one the series takes place in. The family we follow for the rest of the run, the Beth and Jerry and Summer we spend years with, are not even the original versions Rick started the season with. Their real Rick and Morty are rotting in a garage in a ruined dimension. Ours just moved in and started answering to the same names. I need to slow down here, because it is easy to hear that plot and file it as a wild sci-fi swing and miss what it actually says about the man. Rick destroyed a planet. He turned every living person on an entire Earth into a monster. By accident, yes, but through his own recklessness and his own refusal to think about consequences before acting. And when he could not undo it, he did not stay to help. He did not grieve. He did not even seem especially bothered. He shopped for a replacement. The multiverse, to Rick, is a shelf of spare Earths, and when he breaks one, he simply reaches for another and slides his family into the gap where the dead used to be. There is no consequence he cannot outrun by portaling away from it. That is the thing that makes him so dangerous. More dangerous than any monster the writers could invent. A normal villain can at least be cornered, can at least be made to face what he has done. Rick has an escape hatch out of accountability itself, built into the premise, and he uses it here in the 6th episode as casually as changing a channel. And, brilliantly, the family is not left off camera. In the final moments of the episode, we cut back to the ruined world Rick abandoned, and we find that this dimension's Jerry and Beth and Summer are among the last few unmutated humans left alive, scavenging through the wreckage of a civilization their own family patriarch destroyed and fled. And they are, in a quiet and terrible way, doing fine. They are pulling together. Jerry, useless Jerry, is being brave. The family functions in the absence of Rick, in a world Rick ruined, better than it ever seems to function with him in it. That final shot is a verdict delivered without a single line of dialogue, and it lands like a stone. The people Rick claims to be protecting are, on the evidence, safer and more whole when he is gone, even standing in the rubble he left them. This is the first season. We are being told this before we have even finished getting to know these people. The wrecking ball at the center of this family is the man you have been rooting for. What gets me about this episode, more than the horror of it, is how little Rick has to pay. There is no cosmic punishment, no wanted poster, no reckoning. He and Morty walk into a new kitchen and pour a new bowl of cereal, and the theme music plays, and the story continues, as if a genocide were a bad day at work. That impunity is not a plot hole, it is the argument. The reason Rick can behave like a villain and still be your protagonist is that the universe has no mechanism to stop him, no authority above him, no consequence that can stick. He is smarter than every system that might hold him to account, and he knows it, and that knowledge is corrosive. A man who can never be caught slowly stops asking whether he should be. That is the road he is going to walk for 8 seasons, and it started with a love potion for a girl named Jessica. There is a companion truth to the Cronenberg episode, one that runs quieter underneath the grandfather and grandson relationship the whole series is built on, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. We are meant to read Rick and Morty as a bond, a broken but real love between an old man and the boy he drags through hell, and it is that. But we are also told, on screen, in plain words, that there is a second reason Rick keeps Morty close, and the second reason is colder than anything in the plot. Morty is camouflage. The mechanics get spelled out in the 10th episode of the first season, an episode set among a whole society of Ricks and a whole society of Mortys, which we will return to in its own right later because it opens a much larger door. The specific piece I want now is this. Inside the rules of this world, a Rick's intelligence is not just a trait, it is a signal. A genius of Rick's magnitude gives off a distinctive brainwave, a kind of mental broadcast that hostile forces can lock onto and track across space. It is how enemies find a Rick. And the counter to it, the thing that scrambles the signal, is proximity to a Morty. A Morty's brainwaves are described as complementary, the exact opposite shape, so that a Rick standing next to his Morty becomes invisible, his genius canceled out and hidden by the ordinariness of the boy beside him. Morty is not just a sidekick. Morty is a cloaking device that walks and talks and calls him Grandpa. Rick says it out loud, and it is one of the coldest things any protagonist has ever said to a child. He tells Morty that he is a perfect, impenetrable suit of human armor, and that the reason this works, the reason Morty is such good armor, is that Morty is as dumb as Rick is smart. That is the sentence. The love, if it is love, is wrapped around a function. When Morty pushes back, when the boy insists that he is more than a human shield, that he is a person, Rick does not comfort him. He confirms it. Yes, you are a shield. That is what you are. The most watched relationship in the whole run, the one the title is named after, contains at its foundation a man using his grandson's very stupidity as a tool to keep himself hidden from the people who want him dead. And it does not stop at a cruel line. We are shown the extreme the idea can be taken to, and the extreme is horrifying. In that same Society of Ricks episode, we discover a Rick who has taken the camouflage principle to its logical, monstrous end. Off in a hidden facility, thousands of Mortys have been kidnapped from across the multiverse and are being held and hurt, kept alive purely to generate the collective brainwave fog that hides the Rick running the operation. Rows and rows of stolen grandsons, screaming, farmed like livestock for the signal their suffering produces. It is one of the darkest images the series ever commits to, and it is not framed as some alien evil. It is framed as what a Rick does when nothing stops him from doing it. Our Rick is appalled by that facility, and we are meant to notice that he is appalled, because it is one of the ways the writers keep our Rick a step back from the abyss. But they are also drawing the line for you, dotted from our Rick to that horror, and asking you to notice that it is the same line. The difference between the grandfather we love and the monster farming children is a difference of degree. They are both using Mortys as objects. One of them just kept it down to a single boy and calls it family. That is the part that gets me about the whole shield idea. It does not make Rick a monster outright. It makes him a slightly more restrained version of one, and it asks you to decide whether that is a meaningful distinction, and it refuses to answer for you. If you want the single cleanest illustration of how Rick's villainy actually operates, the episode to reach for is the 4th of the 3rd season, the one where Rick and Morty get pulled into a reunion of a superhero team called the Vindicators. It is worth pausing on the setup, because the setup is the whole joke and the whole horror at once. The Vindicators are exactly the kind of self-important, morally clean, save-the-day team that a series like this exists to puncture. They pose, they give speeches, they have a code, and Rick despises them, partly because he thinks their heroism is fake and self-congratulatory, and partly, you suspect, because their sincerity is a mirror he cannot stand to look into. So when the team assembles to take down a world-destroying villain called Worldender, Rick does what Rick does when he is forced to be around people he cannot tolerate. He gets drunk, not tipsy, not loose. He gets so catastrophically blackout, world-erasingly drunk that he loses an entire night of his own life. And this is the piece that matters for the argument, so hold on to it. While he is blacked out, while there is no conscious Rick present, no plan, no wit, no supervision, drunk Rick single-handedly hunts down and defeats Worldender, the threat the entire heroic team could not handle. He does it alone, off-screen, in a state where he will not even remember it. And then, still blacked out, he rigs the team's own headquarters into an elaborate series of death traps, a whole obstacle course of lethal puzzles built in the deliberate, theatrical style of the Saw movies, complete with a distorted voice on a screen, forcing the heroes to solve riddles or die. The Vindicators wake up inside a murder machine that their own supposed ally built while unconscious. Several of them do not survive it. The traps are real, the deaths are real, and the man who designed them was not even awake in any meaningful sense when he did it. Stay on the shape of that for a second, because it is doing something very deliberate. We are being told that Rick's genius does not switch off when his conscience and his restraint and his humor switch off. It runs underneath all of that, on some lower and colder level, and when the top layers of him go dark, what is left is pure capability with no brake on it. Sober Rick is dangerous, but at least there is a person in there making choices. Drunk Rick is the machine with the operator gone, and the machine is still lethal, still brilliant, still building traps. His worst act in this episode is not the product of hatred or a plan. It is the product of his baseline, the thing he is when nothing is holding him back, and that baseline is a killer. The series returns to this again and again, the idea that Rick's most monstrous moments cluster around the bottle, not because the alcohol makes him evil, but because it removes the last thin membrane between the world and what he actually is. And then the episode delivers the detail that turns it from dark to truly bleak, the detail that makes the whole thing a small masterpiece of character writing. The final trap, the centerpiece of the whole murder course, is built as a tribute, a loving, sentimental tribute, to Noob-Noob. Noob-Noob is the lowly, ignored member of the Vindicators' support staff, the janitor figure the real heroes look down on and never thank, and he is the one member of the team that Rick, in his drunken state, decided was worthy of honor, because Noob-Noob laughed at Rick's jokes. That is the entire basis of the sentiment. He laughed. So drunk Rick built a monument of death in his name. And then comes the gut punch. Noob-Noob is not even there. He is off cleaning up a mess elsewhere, stuck doing the menial work while the heroes he serves get slaughtered in a shrine to him he will never see. The one person Rick's blackout self decided to love could not attend his own tribute, and by the time Rick sobers up, found unconscious and filthy in a puddle of his own making, he does not even remember who Noob-Noob is. The one flicker of warmth in the whole atrocity, the one gesture that might have redeemed a sliver of it, evaporates the second he wakes, forgotten, meaningless, gone. That is Rick's villainy in miniature, and it is why this episode is such a perfect specimen. The harm is enormous, a room full of corpses. The reasoning behind it is petty, contempt for people who annoyed him. The one tender impulse inside it is aimed at someone who is not present to receive it. And the whole thing is forgotten by morning, leaving no lesson, no growth, no scar on Rick at all, only bodies. Nobody in the family holds him to account. Morty is horrified, but Morty is always horrified, and it never changes anything. Rick pours himself back into the day, and the story rolls on. If a stranger did what Rick did in this episode, you would call him one of the scariest killers you had ever seen. Because it is Rick. The fandom mostly remembers it as the funny Saw episode. That gap between what he does and how we file it is the exact space this villain lives in. Now let us turn the camera around, because so far we have watched Rick aim his damage outward, at planets and teammates and a grandson, and that is only half of the case. The other half, and I would argue the more important half, is the damage he aims at himself, and there is one scene the whole series is built around on that front, the scene I opened with, and it deserves to be told properly and told once. It comes in the 3rd episode of the 2nd season, an episode whose premise starts almost as a joke. Rick has an old on and off relationship with a being called Unity, a hive mind, a single consciousness that controls an entire planet's worth of interconnected bodies. They reunite, they have a strange and unexpectedly intimate stretch of time together, and for a little while Rick seems, of all things, happy, or at least occupied, at least less alone. And then Unity leaves him. It writes him a goodbye, and the goodbye is devastating precisely because it comes from something that has seen him clearly. Unity tells him, in effect, that being with Rick makes it want to be a lesser version of itself, that his influence is a kind of gravity that pulls everything near him down, and that it has to get away from him to survive. It is not cruel, it is clear-eyed, and it is the clarity that destroys him. Rick comes home, and the episode does something almost unbearable with its restraint. It goes quiet. There are no jokes now, no wild sci-fi, no portal gun. Rick goes into the garage, and he builds a machine, and the machine is a device engineered to disintegrate him, to erase him from existence with a beam. And before he uses it, there is a small creature there, one of his experiments, suffering, and Rick, tender in a way we almost never see him, ends its pain first. He will not let the little thing hurt. And then, with a piece of music swelling underneath, a song fans will forever associate with this exact moment, he positions his own head in the path of the beam and reaches to trigger it. He passes out before it fires. Drunk, exhausted, gone, he slumps over, and the beam does not fire, and that is the only reason he is alive the next morning. He did not choose to live. He simply failed to complete the act. The moment is allowed to sit for a beat, and then, mercilessly, snaps back to comedy, because that is how Rick himself would deflect it, and the whiplash is the point. I want to be careful with this scene, because it is the one truly human moment Rick is ever given, and it would be cheap to reduce it. But in the frame of this whole argument of Rick as his own villain, it is the keystone. Everything cruel he does to other people, he first did to himself. The contempt he pours on the universe, he pours on himself first and hardest. When he tells you that nothing matters, he is not describing a discovery he made about physics. He is describing a wound. The nihilism is not a philosophy he arrived at through his enormous intellect. It is a story he tells himself so that the grief of the bomb, the loss of Diane, the failure to be a person who could keep the people he loved, becomes survivable. If nothing matters, then losing everything does not matter, and if losing everything does not matter, then he does not have to feel it. That is the deal he made. And the garage scene is what happens when the deal fails, when for one night the numbness wears off and the actual size of his despair stands up inside him and reaches for the switch. The villain of this story tried to kill the villain of this story, and the only thing that stopped him was that he was too drunk to finish. There is no darker sentence you can write about a protagonist, and it was written in the 2nd season, and then the series just kept going. So far we have watched Rick damage strangers and damage himself, and you could, if you were feeling generous, file all of it under a man who is careless, a man who does harm the way a hurricane does harm, without intent, just by being what he is, near people who are smaller. But there is a scene that closes that escape route. A scene where Rick's damage to his own family is not careless at all. It is planned. It is engineered, step by step, for his own benefit, and he explains it to Morty with something close to pride. That scene is the ending of the third season premiere, the same episode that first showed us the Diane flashback, and it is, I think, the key scene for understanding Rick as a domestic figure rather than a cosmic one. Here is the situation. Across the gap between the second and third seasons, Rick has been in galactic prison, and his absence has changed the household. Beth and Jerry's marriage, always fragile, has been holding together in the vacuum he left. And when Rick breaks himself out and comes crashing back into their lives, Jerry finally does the thing he has wanted to do for years. He gives Beth an ultimatum. It is him or your father. One of us goes. And Beth chooses Rick. She chooses her father over her husband, and the marriage ends, and Jerry is pushed out of the house. And for a while, it looks like a moment of the family finally freeing itself from a man who was dragging it down, Jerry standing up for himself at last. And then Rick tells Morty the truth, in a monologue that has become one of the most quoted in the whole run, and the truth is that Rick planned all of it. The prison break, the timing, the confrontation, the ultimatum, the divorce. He wanted Jerry gone. Jerry was the one member of the household who saw through him, who resented his influence, who kept trying to pull Beth and the kids back toward a normal life that did not revolve around Rick. So Rick maneuvered the entire situation to remove him. He frames it, chillingly, as a matter of causality, as if he were simply describing the physics of what was always going to happen, the inevitable outcome of forces in motion, when what he is actually describing is a man dismantling his daughter's marriage to make himself the undisputed head of the family. With Jerry gone, there is no rival for the household's loyalty. Beth is his, the kids are his, and Morty, crucially, is locked in, bound to keep going on adventures, because the family structure that might have offered the boy any other kind of life has just been quietly demolished by the grandfather who needs him. That is the villainy that cannot be explained away as carelessness, and it is worse than the planet he ruined, in a way, because it is intimate, and it is deliberate, and the victims are the people he claims to love. Rick did not blunder into breaking up the family. He wanted a particular arrangement of the household, an arrangement with himself at the center and no competing authority, and he was willing to detonate his daughter's marriage and reshape his grandson's future to get it. He talks about love a lot, this man, but watch what he actually does with the family when he has a free hand, and what he does is arrange them, like pieces, into the configuration that serves him. Beth spends the whole series desperate for her father's approval, and we are shown quite clearly that this desperation is a wound Rick himself inflicted through decades of absence, and here he is, using that very wound, using the fact that she will always choose him to get rid of the one person who was inconvenient to him. It is a masterclass in how a certain kind of person weaponizes the love of the people who cannot help loving them. What makes the monologue land so hard is Rick's tone. He is not gloating exactly, and he is not confessing with any guilt. He is explaining, the way you would explain a card trick to a child who is old enough now to understand how they were fooled. There is a terrible flatness to it, a sense that this is simply how Rick sees all human arrangements, as systems to be gamed, as levers to be pulled, and that the difference between his family and a room full of strangers is only that he happens to sleep in this particular house. You are handed a grandfather and then, in one monologue, shown the calculating operator underneath the grandfather and asked to hold both, because both are true, and the horror is that they are true at the same time. This is the man reading Morty bedtime stories. This is the man who just wrecked his daughter's life on purpose and called it weather. If the third season premiere shows Rick manipulating his family from the outside, another episode from that same season turns the lens inward and gets the series to more or less state its own thesis about him out loud, through a character built specifically to see through him. That episode is the third of the third season, the one everyone knows even if they have never watched a minute of it, the one where Rick turns himself into a pickle. On the surface, it is the ultimate flex of the show's absurdity. A whole episode built around Rick as a talking vegetable, improvising his way through increasingly violent set pieces with nothing but his intellect. And it is that, and it is a lot of fun. But the reason the pickle exists at all is the part that matters, and it is easy to miss under the action. The pickle is an avoidance strategy. The family, at Beth's insistence, is supposed to attend a session of family therapy, and Rick does not want to go. So rather than simply refuse, rather than say no like an adult, Rick turns himself into a pickle, apparently at random, apparently as a science experiment, specifically timed so that he has a rock-solid excuse to skip the appointment. He would rather transform his own body into a brine-soaked vegetable and fight his way through a building full of armed men than sit in a chair for an hour and be asked how he feels. And the therapist, a woman named Dr. Wong, is not fooled for a second. When Rick and the family finally do end up in her office, she delivers the closest thing this series has to a mission statement about its own lead, and she delivers it calmly, without raising her voice, which makes it land harder. She tells Rick and the family that they all use their intelligence to avoid the work of being well. That the mind, the very thing they are all so proud of, has become the thing they hide behind. She points out that Rick treats his own genius as two contradictory things depending on what is convenient. Sometimes an unstoppable force that makes him superior to everyone and answerable to no one, and sometimes an inescapable curse, a burden so heavy that no one could expect a mind like his to bother with something as small as feelings or maintenance or repair. And she names the real choice underneath all of it. She says that Rick would rather go on wild, dangerous, self-destructive adventures than do the boring, unglamorous, daily labor of keeping himself and his relationships in working order. The adventures are not freedom. The adventures are the avoidance. The whole series, in a sense, is Rick running as fast and as far and as spectacularly as he can from a single chair in a small office where a woman would ask him to be honest. And Rick's response to this, when he finally gives one, is a very Rick thing to do. He does not argue with the diagnosis. He essentially concedes that she is right and then explains why he will not do anything about it. He says he does not respect therapy because he is a scientist, because he invents and transforms and creates, and he cannot see the machinery in himself that would let him respect a process he cannot control or outsmart. It is a stunning moment because it is Rick admitting, in his own words, that he understands exactly what is wrong with him and has decided that fixing it is beneath him. He is not blind to his own condition. That would be a tragedy of ignorance, and it would be easier to forgive. He sees it clearly, more clearly than anyone, and he chooses it anyway, because the version of himself that would get well is a smaller and more ordinary man, and Rick would rather be a magnificent wreck than a healthy nobody. That, right there, is the difference between a man who is sick and a man who is complicit in his own sickness. Rick is the second one. He is not a prisoner of his depression. He is its warden, and he keeps re-signing the lease. That is why I keep coming back to the word villain rather than the word tragedy, even in the moments where the writing is at its most tender toward him. A tragedy is something that happens to a person. What happens across these episodes is something Rick keeps choosing, with full understanding, again and again. Dr. Wong hands him the map out of the maze, spells out where the exit is, and Rick reads it, nods, and walks deeper in, because he has decided the maze is the only place a mind like his belongs. And the people who love him are stuck in the maze with him, because he will not leave, and he will not let them build a life that does not orbit around his refusal to leave. There is an episode a few installments later in that same third season that takes this idea, the idea that Rick's real enemy is inside him, and makes it literal, and it is one of the sharpest things the writers ever did with the character. It is the 6th episode of the season, the one where Rick and Morty visit a detox spa. The premise of the spa is elegant. It has a machine that will remove from a person everything that is toxic about them, purge the poison, and leave behind a clean, healthy, unburdened version. Rick and Morty both go through it, and the machine does exactly what it promises. It splits each of them in two. There is now a healthy Rick, calm and warm and functional, and there is everything the machine judged to be toxic, pulled out and left behind as a separate, physical creature, a snarling green figure that fans call Toxic Rick. Here is the twist that turns the whole thing into a diagnosis. The machine does not remove what is objectively bad about a person. It removes what the person themselves considers toxic, the parts they are ashamed of, the parts they have decided are the problem. So when you look at what got pulled out of Rick, you are not looking at some neutral list of vices. You are looking at Rick's own private verdict on which pieces of himself are the poison, and the contents are revealing in a way that is almost unbearable. Yes, the toxic half took his arrogance, his rage, his need to control everything and everyone, but it also took his attachments. It took his feelings for his family. It took, specifically and unmistakably, his love for Morty. The healthy, cleaned-up Rick who walks out of that machine is not just calmer. He is emptier. He has been freed of his cruelty and his caring in the same stroke, because in Rick's own estimation, they are the same substance, the same weakness, the same poison. Think about what that means as a statement of character. We are being told, through the logic of the machine, that Rick himself classifies loving his grandson as a defect. When Rick imagines the version of himself with all the bad parts scrubbed away, the version he would be if he could finally be healthy, that version does not love anyone, because to Rick, love is one of the toxins. It is a thing that got Diane killed. It is a thing that makes you vulnerable, that gives the universe a handle to hurt you by. And so, deep in the part of him the machine could read, Rick has filed his own capacity for attachment in the same drawer as his worst qualities, marked poison, to be purged. That is a man at war with the best thing left in him. That is a man who has decided that the small warmth he still feels for a scared teenager is a bug in his system rather than the one thing keeping him human. And the episode does not let the healthy version be the happy ending, which is the masterstroke. Toxic Rick, the discarded half, is not a mindless monster. He is Rick's ambition and Rick's contempt and Rick's grandiosity with nothing to balance them, and he immediately sets about trying to do what that combination always wants to do, which is to remake the world into a more logical, more controlled, more Rick-shaped place, with everyone else beneath him. He is what Rick would be if the cruelty had no counterweight at all, and the two halves have to be reunited, because neither one is a person, because the truth the episode arrives at is that Rick is the whole ugly package, the love and the poison inseparable, and any attempt to keep only the clean parts produces either a hollow man or a tyrant. The healthy Rick is a ghost. The toxic Rick is a would-be god. The real Rick is the impossible, unstable sum of both, and he has to live inside that sum every single day, and he numbs it with alcohol because the alternative is feeling the contradiction all the time. I keep calling Rick his own villain, and this is the episode that proves it is not a figure of speech. When you literally externalize the enemy inside him, when you pull it out and give it a body and let it walk around, it does not look like an alien or a rival scientist. It looks like Rick. The thing trying to conquer the world at the end of that episode is Rick, with the brakes cut. The call is coming from inside the house, and here the door opens and shows you the caller, and the caller has Rick's face. There is no external villain in that story at all. There is only Rick, divided against himself, one half trying to burn everything down, and the other half too empty to care. And the resolution is not victory over an enemy, but the grim reassembly of a man who cannot be well because he has decided that wellness would cost him the last of his humanity. If Toxic Rick shows you the enemy inside, there is an episode in the 4th season that shows you what Rick does with his power when the only thing at stake is his ego, and it is, for my money, among the coldly monstrous things he ever does, precisely because the harm is so vast and the motive is so small. It is the 8th episode of the 4th season, and it grows out of an argument. Morty complains about one of Rick's schemes, a ruse involving a fake vat of acid that Rick uses to escape a bad situation by pretending to melt himself and hiding instead. Morty thinks it is stupid. He says so. And Rick, wounded in the one place he is always wounded, his pride, decides to teach Morty a lesson, to prove that his way of doing things is superior, to win an argument he cannot let go of. So Rick builds Morty a device. He sells it as a gift, a wondrous piece of technology. It is, he says, a save point, like in a video game. Press the button, and the moment is saved. Live your life, take any risk you want, And if it goes wrong, press the button again and you snap back to the saved moment with everything reset. No consequences. Immortality by reload. And Morty, being a teenager handed a cheat code for reality, does exactly what you would expect. He uses it to live without fear. He does reckless, joyful, dangerous things. He falls in love, he takes risks he never could have taken, he lives a whole arc of freedom, all on the promise that he can always reload back to safety. And then Rick reveals the trick, and the trick is horrifying. The device does not rewind time. It cannot. Time does not work that way, even for Rick. What it actually does, every single time Morty presses it, is destroy the Morty who pressed it and teleport his consciousness into a parallel dimension, into the body of a nearly identical Morty in a nearly identical world, a Morty who has to be gotten out of the way to make room. Every reload is a death and a body snatch. Every time Morty thought he was undoing a mistake, he was actually killing a version of himself in another reality and stealing that version's life, leaving a trail of dead Mortys across the multiverse, one for every button press. Every one of them a real boy with a real family who simply blinked out so that our Morty could have a do-over. Morty did this dozens of times. Rick knew the whole time. Rick built it that way on purpose. Let that sink in, because the scale of it is easy to lose under the cleverness. Rick engineered the deaths of countless versions of his own grandson, spread across countless realities, and he did it not for survival, not for revenge, not for any grand purpose, but to win a domestic argument. Morty said his acid trick was dumb, and Rick's response was to construct a machine that would murder an untold number of children to make a point about who was right. And when the reveal comes, Rick is not remorseful. He is vindicated. See, he tells Morty, in effect, this is why I do things my way. This is what happens when you think you know better. The bodies are just the cost of the lesson. This is the same man, remember, who tells you constantly that nothing matters, that the multiverse is infinite so no single life has weight, that morality is a childish human hang-up. This episode is what that philosophy looks like when it is actually applied. If no life matters, then 1,000 dead Mortys are worth less than the satisfaction of being right. And Rick, who says he believes exactly that, acts on it without hesitation. The nihilism is not an idle pose he strikes at parties. It is an operating system, and it runs, and this is the output. Up to now, we have mostly stayed at the scale of the family and the individual episode, but to really understand why Rick qualifies as the villain of his own show, you have to zoom all the way out, past the garage, past the planet, to the shape of the multiverse itself, because Rick did not just misbehave inside his world. He built the world. And the structure he built is possibly the most damning single piece of evidence in the whole case, because it reveals that everything Rick claims to hate, all the rules and institutions and systems he spends the series rebelling against and sneering at, are things he himself created to serve his own vanity. The concept the 5th season finale finally hands us is called the central finite curve, and it is worth explaining carefully because it reorganizes everything. The premise of Rick and Morty has always been that the multiverse is infinite, every possible reality existing side by side, an endless fan of variation. In an infinite multiverse, there are infinite Ricks, and among those infinite Ricks, there must be some where a Rick is not the smartest thing alive, where he is outclassed, where something bigger and cleverer exists. And the Ricks, collectively, could not stand that. So at some point in the deep past, they walled off a section of the infinite. They drew a boundary around a curated slice of all possible realities, a slice specifically selected to contain only the universes in which a Rick is the smartest being in existence. Everything outside that boundary, every reality where a Rick is not the top of the intellectual food chain, was cut off, excluded, placed on the other side of a wall. That walled-off slice is the central finite curve, and it is, functionally, the only multiverse this show has ever taken place in. Every adventure, every alternate Earth, every version of the family, all of it happens inside a finite bubble the Ricks built for one reason: to guarantee that no matter which door you open, a Rick is always the cleverest man in the room. Stay with the arrogance of that for a second, because it is almost too large to feel. Most people, if they could edit reality, might fix a mistake, save a person, undo a loss. The Ricks edited reality to protect their own egos. They carved the infinite down to a shape that flatters them, an entire cosmos gerrymandered so that a Rick can never lose, never be the second smartest, never have to look up at anything. And here is the piece that matters for our specific Rick, the one we follow. He is not an innocent bystander to this. He is not a Rick who stumbled into a system other Ricks made. We are told plainly that our Rick was instrumental, that the great institution of Rick society, the citadel of Ricks, the whole apparatus of Rick government and Rick law and Rick order, would not exist without him. He helped build it. He is, in a real sense, its founding father. The society he spends 8 seasons mocking as a bureaucratic nightmare, the council of grandpas he treats with such theatrical disgust, is a house he helped raise. This is the hypocrisy at the center of Rick's whole rebel pose, and once you see it, you cannot take the pose seriously again. Rick presents himself, constantly, as the ultimate outsider, the one free man, the anarchist genius who bows to no authority and belongs to no system. He rolls his eyes at the citadel. He calls the other Ricks sheep, cowards, bureaucrats who could not handle real freedom. But the citadel is his. The central finite curve, the cosmic cage that guarantees his supremacy, is his. He did not escape the system. He designed the system, and then he styled himself as its lone dissident so that he could enjoy both the power of having built it and the glamour of pretending to stand against it. It is the oldest move in the book for a certain kind of powerful man. Build the machine, profit from the machine, and then, to feel clean, spit on the machine in public and call yourself a rebel. Rick is the architect cosplaying as the resistance, and the cost of that vanity project, the human cost, is enormous, because the central finite curve is not a victimless indulgence. To wall off the tiny slice of the infinite where a Rick reigns supreme, the Ricks had to turn their backs on everything else, on all the infinite realities full of infinite suffering that a being of Rick's power could theoretically have helped. Rick has the capability to do almost anything, to fix almost anything, and he spent that capability building a fence around his own greatness. Every Morty ground up in the Citadel's machinery, every ordinary Rick living a small managed life inside the bubble, every version of the family shaped by a cosmos that exists to service one man's ego, all of it is downstream of a choice Rick made. He had infinity in his hands, the same infinity Rick Prime offered him at the door all those years ago, and where Rick Prime used his freedom to become a wandering killer, our Rick used his to build a kingdom with himself on the throne and then complain about the weather in it. The difference between them is real, but it is smaller than Rick would ever admit, and the story is about to make him say so out loud, through the mouth of a child. Because the central finite curve produced the one villain in this show who truly frightens Rick, the one antagonist who is not a monster or an alien but a symptom, a thing Rick's own world grew like an infection, and his name, if you can call it a name, is Evil Morty. And I have to be precise here because this is exactly the kind of lore that gets muddled in the retelling, and viewers rightly notice when it does. Evil Morty is a Morty, one of the infinite Mortys, but a Morty who did the thing no Morty is supposed to be able to do. He got smart, he got angry, and instead of being the passive, stammering, expendable sidekick the whole system depends on Morty's being, he turned his intelligence against the structure itself. And I want to correct a mistake that gets made about him constantly, because getting it wrong is the kind of thing an attentive viewer catches. Evil Morty is not our Rick's original Morty. The Rick that Evil Morty was once attached to, back when he first appears in the 10th episode of the first season, was a separate Rick, a lobotomized, half-cyborg Rick that Evil Morty was secretly controlling from behind, puppeting through a device, using as a front. Evil Morty was never our protagonist's grandson. Do not let anyone tell you our Rick created Evil Morty personally. What created Evil Morty was not one Rick, but all of them, the whole system, the entire condition of being a Morty in a universe built by Ricks for Ricks. Because that is what Evil Morty actually is, and it is why he belongs in this argument, even though he is technically Rick's enemy. Evil Morty is the case against Rick, made flesh. He is what happens when one of the infinite disposable grandsons, one of the boys used as shields and cloaking devices and save point fodder, finally wakes up and understands what has been done to him and to every version of him. He looks at the central finite curve, the cosmic cage built to guarantee a Rick is always on top, and he does not want to rule it. He wants out. His entire arc, his entire genius, is bent toward a single goal, escaping the curve entirely, getting to the true infinite on the other side of the wall, the realities the Ricks cut themselves off from, where a Rick is not automatically king, and a Morty might, for once, just be a person. Evil Morty does not want to become a Rick. He wants to be free of Ricks, and in the 5th season finale he does it. He uses the population of the Citadel, all those Ricks and Mortys, as fuel, and he burns through the wall, and he walks out of the only universe this show has ever known into the real infinite beyond, gone, free, uninterested in ever coming back. The reason Evil Morty matters so much to the case against Rick is the mirror he holds up. Great care is taken to make you understand that Evil Morty is not evil the way a comic book villain is evil. He is cold, he is ruthless, he kills without hesitation, but every terrible thing he does is in service of escaping a prison that Rick and the Ricks built. He is the logical product of Rick's world. If you treat an infinite number of children as tools, as armor, as disposable, then sooner or later one of them is going to get smart enough to hate you for it and strong enough to do something about it. And that child will not look like a hero, because the system that made him did not leave room for heroes. Evil Morty is the bill coming due. He is Rick's own cruelty, and the cruelty of every Rick, folded back into a single grandson-shaped blade and pointed at the whole rotten structure. And the quietest, most devastating thing done with him is the refusal to fully condemn him. When Evil Morty walks out through the wall, it is not framed as a tragedy or a triumph exactly. It is framed as an escape that was earned, a prisoner going over the wall of a prison he did not build and did not deserve. Our Rick, watching, has the good grace to let him go. On some level, Rick knows. He knows the kid is right about the world. He knows who built the walls. He just cannot bring himself to be the one to tear them down. Because tearing them down would mean giving up the one thing all of it was for, the guarantee that he, Rick, is the smartest man alive. And so the mirror holds, and it is not flattering, and Rick looks away. Which brings us, finally, to the confrontation the whole series was quietly building toward, the meeting between Rick and the version of himself who did the murder. And it is here that the boldest statement about what kind of man our protagonist really is gets made, because he is allowed to win, and then we are shown that winning turns him into exactly the thing he was chasing. The version of Rick who planted the bomb, the one the fandom and eventually the writers call Rick Prime, is the true architect of everything. He is the cold, unbothered, purposeless killer our Rick might have become if grief had taken the last piece of him. And for decades of in-story time, hunting Rick Prime is the secret spine of the entire show. The real reason behind the portal gun. The real thing under all the drinking and all the adventures. Every terrible thing our Rick does, on some level, he does while carrying this hunt, this single unfinished piece of business, the man who took Diane, still out there somewhere in the infinite. The reckoning comes in the 5th episode of the 7th season, and it is a brutal, ugly, deeply satisfying, and deeply hollow piece of television, and every part of that combination is intentional. To get to Rick Prime, our Rick has to swallow his pride and team up with two people. One is Morty, of course. The other is Evil Morty, back from over the wall for reasons of his own, the escaped prisoner returning to help settle a score against the man who represents everything he fled. And it is worth noticing who Rick has to align with to win. Not heroes, not the family. The coldest, most ruthless version of a grandson the show has ever produced. To kill the monster, Rick partners with the closest thing the show has to another monster, and the three of them corner Rick Prime. Now, before the fight, we have to talk about the Omega device, because it is the single hardest fact in this whole story to get right, and the one most likely to be mangled in the retelling. Rick Prime has, at his disposal, a weapon called the Omega device. What it does is almost incomprehensibly cruel. It does not kill a person. It erases a person from every reality at once, deletes all infinite variants of a single individual across the entire multiverse in one stroke, so that it is not merely that they die, it is that they never existed anywhere and never can again. And Rick Prime, at some point, used it. He used it on Diane. Not on one Diane, on Diane. On every version of her that ever was or could be, wiped out of infinity in a single blast, specifically to twist the knife in the one Rick who would not stop coming for him, to make sure that even if our Rick ever fantasized about slipping sideways into some reality where his wife had survived, there would be no such reality, not one, not anywhere. This is the fact I need you to hold, because it is the one people get wrong most often and it matters enormously. There is no universe where Diane is alive. Rick Prime made certain of it. The multiverse is infinite, and in all of that infinity, thanks to that device, there is not a single door Rick could open to find her. The one thing his infinite power cannot buy him is the one thing he wanted, and his enemy engineered that on purpose. The fight itself is short and savage. Evil Morty is the one who actually incapacitates Rick Prime, and Evil Morty is the one who gets hold of the Omega device and shuts it down, deactivates it, takes it off the board, which matters, because it means the weapon is gone, spent, neutralized, not lurking out there to be used again. And then Evil Morty, having done the hard part, simply steps back and lets our Rick have the thing he has wanted his whole life. He lets Rick beat Rick Prime to death with his bare hands. There is no clever gadget, no elegant science, no witty one-liner that diffuses the moment. There is just an old man beating another old man with his own face to death on the ground. Decades of grief coming out through his fists. And it is not triumphant. It is grim and animal and sad. Rick gets his revenge. He finally actually does the thing. The man who killed Diane is dead, killed by Rick's own hands, and the score that defined an entire life is settled. And then the show does the thing that makes it a great show instead of just a dark one. It shows you that the revenge does not fix anything. It cannot. Diane is still erased from all of infinity. The bomb still went off. The decades of collateral damage, the ruined planets and used grandsons and detonated marriages, all of it still happened. Killing Rick Prime does not undo a single moment of it. All it does is remove the one thing that was giving Rick's misery a direction. The one piece of unfinished business that let him tell himself his life still had a purpose, that all the drinking and all the cruelty were in service of a mission. With Rick Prime dead, the mission is over, and Rick is left holding the thing every person driven by revenge is eventually left holding, which is nothing, an empty pair of hands and a life built entirely around a hunt that has ended. He becomes, in the act of killing the killer, a version of the same purposeless creature Rick Prime was, a man with infinite power and nothing left to want. He spent his whole life defining himself against Rick Prime, and in beating him to death, he finished the only project he had. And what is a man who was only ever a revenge, once the revenge is complete? The back half of the recent seasons asks exactly that, and it does not pretend the answer is easy. That is the deepest version of the argument that Rick is his own villain. It is not just that he hurts people. It is that the thing he built his identity on, the righteous hunt for the man who wronged him, was itself the trap. Rick Prime was not only Rick's enemy. Rick Prime was Rick's excuse. The reason he gave himself for staying a monster. The mission that justified never healing, never stopping, never sitting in Dr. Wong's chair. As long as Rick Prime was alive, Rick could tell himself he was the wronged party, the avenger, the good guy in at least this one story. And then he kills him, and the excuse dies with him, and there is nobody left to blame for what Rick has become except Rick. That is the villain finally running out of villain to point at. That is the moment the mirror has no one else in it. If Rick Prime is the wound at the top of Rick's life, Beth is the wound in the middle of it. The ongoing, living damage. The daughter he broke slowly rather than all at once. And her story might be the saddest strand in the whole case. Because unlike a ruined planet you can look away from, Beth is right there at the dinner table, being hurt in real time, for years. To understand what Rick did to Beth, you have to go back before the series, to a childhood the fourth season finally shows us, and it is not pretty. Rick was absent for most of Beth's life, gone for around 2 decades, off across the multiverse hunting Rick Prime and being a god, while his surviving daughter grew up without a father. And when he was present, he was worse than absent, because he was cold, unavailable, a genius who made it clear that his child was less interesting to him than his work. The episode that lays this bare is the 9th of the 4th season, and it hands us an image of Rick's parenting that is hard to shake. When Beth was a little girl, difficult and lonely and acting out, Rick did not do the work of raising her. He built her a world. He created an entire pocket dimension, a candy-colored fantasy playground called Froopyland, and he put his young daughter inside it and left her there, essentially using a whole reality as a babysitter so he would not have to deal with her. And the reason he gives, the way he frames it, is the cruel part. He tells himself, and later tells others, was a psychopath, a dangerous child, that he built Froopyland to contain her for everyone's safety. But the episode lets you see the other reading underneath, the reading Beth herself reaches for, which is that a lonely little girl acted out because her brilliant father would not look at her, and that same father then used her acting out as the excuse to get rid of her, to file her under problem to be contained rather than daughter to be loved. He decided his child was a monster, and that decision was a lot more convenient for a man who did not want to be a father than it was true. And that abandonment, that early verdict, echoes through Beth's entire adult life, which is the tragedy the series keeps returning to. Beth grows up starved for her father's approval, and she never stops trying to earn it, and Rick, who created that hunger, spends the run alternately exploiting it and ignoring it. It is why, as we saw, she chooses him over her own husband without hesitation. It is a big part of why she stayed married to Jerry for so long in the first place, because Jerry, for all his uselessness, has the one quality her father never had. He stays, he does not leave, he is not going anywhere, and to a woman abandoned by the most important man in her life, a partner who simply refuses to leave is worth more than a partner who is impressive. Rick's absence shaped the whole architecture of his daughter's choices. He was not there, and being not there turned out to be one of the defining forces in her life, a hole in the shape of a father she has been trying to fill with the wrong things ever since. But the darkest thing Rick does to Beth is not in the past. It comes in that same 4th season, and it is a piece of villainy so strange and so cruel that people still argue about it. Beth, exhausted by her small life, tells Rick she wants to escape, to go out into the universe and be free the way he is. And Rick offers her a deal. He offers to make a clone of her, a perfect copy with all her memories, so that one Beth can stay on Earth and live the family life, while the other Beth flies off into space to have adventures. And Beth agrees, and Rick makes the clone, and one Beth goes to the stars, and one Beth stays home. And that would be a strange enough thing on its own, but Rick does something on top of it that turns it from strange into monstrous. After he makes the clone, he deliberately removes the labels that would tell them apart. He shuffles the 2 Beths so he cannot tell which is the original and which is the copy. And then, so that he can never work it out, never reverse engineer the answer, he wipes his own memory of the process. He engineers, on purpose, a permanent state of not knowing which of his daughters is the real one. Try to hold the full weight of what that means, because it is easy to let the sci-fi gloss over it. There are now 2 Beths, one on Earth and one in space, and both of them are, from the inside, completely certain they are the real Beth, with a real childhood and a real father and a real life. And neither of them can ever be sure, and neither can Rick, and neither can the audience. It has been kept deliberately unresolved ever since, and it is important to say clearly that there is no answer, that it has been made deliberately unknowable, that anyone who tells you they know which Beth is the clone is guessing. That is the design. Rick took his own daughter's most basic possession, the certainty of being herself, the simple fact of I am the one who was actually born, and he detonated it, permanently, so that he would never have to face a choice he found uncomfortable. And why did he do it? That is the question that turns this from a weird plot into a portrait of the man. He did it to avoid a feeling. If Rick had kept the labels, if he knew which Beth was the original, then when the space Beth flew off, he would have had to know, every day, whether the daughter at his breakfast table was his real child or a copy he had made. And either answer would have hurt. Either answer would have forced him to feel the loss of the one who left, or the strangeness of loving a duplicate. So he did what Rick always does with a feeling he cannot outsmart. He made it disappear. He would rather live inside a permanent, unsolvable mystery about the identity of his own daughter than face a single moment of clean, painful clarity. It is the Pickle all over again, the vat of acid all over again, the same core move, the genius reaching for a technological escape hatch out of an emotion that a normal person would just have to feel. Except this time, the escape hatch is built out of his daughter's soul. He did not just avoid his own pain. He made both versions of his child permanently uncertain of their own reality to spare himself an afternoon of difficulty. There is a version of this show, an easier and more comforting one, where the clone gambit is a loving gesture, a father giving his daughter the gift of freedom without the guilt. And you are allowed to hear that reading because Rick is good at framing his cruelties as gifts. But look at what he actually optimized for, and it was not Beth's freedom, it was his own comfort, his own ability to keep the family running smoothly without having to confront the hole a departing daughter would leave. Beth got her escape, sure, but the price, the mind wipe, the shuffle, the permanent uncertainty, that price was paid entirely to protect Rick from having to feel something. He turned his daughter's identity into a shell game and then threw away the ball, and he called it love, and some part of him may even believe that, which is somehow worse than if he were lying. We have spent a lot of time on Beth and Morty because they are where Rick's damage runs deepest. But the villain of a household does not hurt only his favorites. And the other two people in that house, Summer and Jerry, catch a quieter, more everyday kind of harm that is worth naming because it completes the picture. Summer, the older grandchild, spends much of the series as an afterthought to Rick, and the writing is honest about this in a way that stings. Where Morty is dragged everywhere, chosen, needed, if only as camouflage, Summer is frequently left behind, overlooked, treated as the spare, the one whose company Rick does not particularly seek out. And the cruel irony is that Summer wants what Morty has. She wants her grandfather to find her interesting, to take her along, to see her as worthy of the great adventures. She craves exactly the attention that is quietly destroying her little brother, without understanding that the attention is a poison, that being Rick's chosen one is a wound and not a prize. Rick's neglect of Summer is a different flavor of the same disease. With Morty, he over-involves, using the boy up. With Summer, he under-involves, leaving her to feel like the one who did not make the cut. Either way, the child is defined by Rick's needs rather than her own, valued for her usefulness or dismissed for her lack of it. And either way, a kid grows up learning that love in this house is conditional on being of interest to a man who is bored by almost everything. And the thing that most breaks my heart about Summer is that she never once figures out that the prize she is competing for is poisoned. She spends years trying to earn a seat in the car, and if she ever won it outright, she would end up exactly where Morty is, hollowed out by the very attention she was begging for. The show lets her keep wanting it, and never lets her understand that the wanting is the trap, which is its own small cruelty, layered on top of Rick's, and nobody in that house is equipped to point it out to her. And then there is Jerry, and Jerry is the strangest case of all, because Jerry is the one member of the family Rick actively despises, and the reasons Rick despises him say more about Rick than about Jerry. On the surface, Rick's contempt is easy to understand and even easy to share. Jerry is insecure, mediocre, needy, often foolish, the kind of man who fails upward and whines about it. He is an easy target, and Rick, who has no patience for weakness of any kind, treats him as a punching bag for 8 seasons, mocking him, undermining him, and, as we have already seen, engineering his removal from the family entirely when he becomes inconvenient. But look closer at what Rick is actually contemptuous of, and it is not really Jerry's stupidity, because Rick tolerates plenty of stupidity. He built his whole safety around Morty's. What Rick truly cannot stand about Jerry is the thing Jerry can do that Rick cannot. Jerry loves without conditions. Jerry stays. Jerry, for all his flaws, is capable of a simple, unglamorous, unconditional devotion to his family. the exact thing Rick lost the capacity for on the morning of the bomb. Jerry is not smart, but Jerry can be present, can be loyal, can love someone without needing a reason or an exit. And Rick, who can rebuild a person atom by atom, cannot do that anymore, and on some level he knows it. So Rick's hatred of Jerry is, I would argue, partly a hatred of the mirror again, but an inverted mirror this time. Evil Morty showed Rick his own cruelty. Jerry shows Rick his own poverty, the emotional capacity Rick traded away for power and never got back. Rick can travel between universes, can wall off the infinite, and he cannot do the one thing this useless, unimpressive man does every single day, which is simply to keep loving his family without needing to be the biggest thing in the room. It must be unbearable to be that powerful and to watch a man you consider beneath you possess the one thing your power cannot manufacture. And so Rick punishes Jerry for it, grinds him down, makes him small, because as long as Jerry is a joke, Rick does not have to admit that Jerry is rich in the one currency Rick is bankrupt in. The villain of this household does not just hurt the people he loves. He hurts the one person who is better at loving than he is, precisely because that person is better at it, and he calls it comedy. Now, at this point in a video like this, a fair viewer might push back and say, all of this is a reading, an interpretation. You are choosing to see a villain because you decided in advance to look for one, and the show is really just a comedy about a wacky scientist. And that would be a reasonable objection for almost any other cartoon. What makes it fail for this one is that Rick and Morty does not leave the argument to the fans. It makes the case against Rick itself, out loud, on screen, repeatedly, and the person who makes it most often is Rick. That is the thing that lifts this from fan theory to text. Rick knows he is the bad guy. He says so. He has said so in some form in nearly every season, and entire episodes have been built around the fact that this lead is aware of his own villainy and has simply decided he can live with it. We already heard Dr. Wong lay it out in the therapy office, and we heard Rick concede the diagnosis and refuse the cure. But it goes further than any one scene. The whole design of the character, according to the people who make the show, is built to prevent you from settling into comfortable admiration. Dan Harmon, the co-creator and showrunner, has talked about this in interview after interview, and the through line of everything he says is consistent. Rick is not meant to be aspirational. Rick is not a role model dressed up as an anti-hero. Rick is a warning wearing the costume of a hero. And the moment an audience starts wanting to be Rick, the show has, in a sense, failed at part of its job, or at least the audience has misread it. Harmon has put the moral test bluntly, in the same spirit as that old idea we started with. If a person finds themselves in a situation and has to stop and wonder whether they are the villain of it, then the wondering is the answer, because the genuinely good never have to check. Rick lives permanently inside that wondering, and he keeps getting put in situations designed to make the question unavoidable, and then we watch him decide, again and again, that he does not care what the answer is. There is a real-world dimension to the show's relationship with its lead that is worth stating plainly and carefully, because it became part of the story of the series whether the show wanted it to or not. For the first 6 seasons, Rick and Morty were both voiced by the same man, Justin Roiland, the co-creator, who performed the grandfather and the grandson as a kind of two-man argument inside his own throat, the smartest voice and the scared little voice coming from the same person. In early 2023, Adult Swim cut ties with Roiland and removed him from the show. I am going to stick to what is documented because the rules of doing this honestly matter more than any dramatic flourish. He was let go by the network, the roles were recast, and from the 7th season onward, Rick is voiced by Ian Cardoni and Morty by Harry Belden, 2 performers brought in to continue the characters. The recasting was seamless enough that many viewers had to be told it had happened, which is its own strange footnote, a show about replaceable versions of people quietly replacing the voice of its own lead and carrying on as if nothing had changed. I will not speculate beyond the documented facts about any of the people involved, because that is not what this channel is for. But it is fair to note the eerie rhyme that a series so obsessed with substitution, with swapping one version of a person for another and pretending the seam is invisible, went through exactly that in real life and survived it, The way Rick survives everything, by moving on before the grief can land. What I find most telling about the meta layer, though, is not the production drama. It is how comfortable the show is telling you the truth about its own hero and trusting you to keep watching anyway. Most shows that discover their protagonist is a monster either soften him or punish him. Rick and Morty does neither. It just keeps handing you the evidence, keeps letting Rick say the quiet part out loud, keeps refusing to either redeem him with a tidy arc or condemn him with a comeuppance. And it dares you to sit in the discomfort of loving a character you have been told, in plain language, that you should not want to be. That refusal is the whole ethical engine of the thing. The writers are not confused about whether Rick is good. They know. They told you. The only person who ever seems confused about it is the viewer who wants Rick to be cool, and that viewer is treated, gently, as the person the show is really trying to reach, the way a warning is aimed at exactly the people most likely to ignore it. And that leads to the question underneath all of this, the one that makes Rick a genuinely tragic figure rather than a simple bad man, which is the problem of being the cleverest being alive. Because a lot of what looks like villainy in Rick is downstream of a single condition the show takes very seriously, and that condition is that he is right about too much. Rick is not deluded. When he says the universe is indifferent, he is, within the physics of his own world, correct. When he says that in an infinite multiverse no single life carries the weight we want it to, he is, coldly, describing the actual rules he lives under. When he treats other people's beliefs and comforts and moralities as childish stories they tell themselves, he is not entirely wrong, and that is what makes him so hard to argue with and so poisonous to be around. The tragedy of Rick's intelligence is that it stripped away every illusion that makes life bearable for everyone else, and left him standing in the cold, clear light of a universe that genuinely does not care, and gave him no way back into the warm dark where the rest of us live. This is where the villainy and the tragedy fuse into the same thing, and it is the deepest layer of the whole argument. Rick's cruelty is not separate from his genius. It is his genius, turned toward people. He sees through everything, and seeing through everything means he sees through love, through meaning, through the small daily fictions that let a family function. And once you can see through something, it is very hard to keep feeling it. Rick cannot unknow what he knows. He cannot make himself believe that his grandson matters cosmically, because cosmically nothing does, and he has the intelligence to prove it to himself anytime he wants. And so he is trapped. He is the man who climbed high enough to see that the mountain has no summit and no meaning, and now he cannot enjoy the climb the way the people below him do, and he despises them a little for being able to, and he envies them a lot for the same reason. His intelligence is exactly the curse Dr. Wong named, an inescapable one, and his villainy is what a person does when they are that smart and that wounded, and have decided that since nothing matters, they are permitted to do anything. He is not dangerous because he is stupid or cruel by nature. He is dangerous because he is clever enough to have talked himself out of every reason not to be. But, and this is the crucial counterweight, the show does not let him off with that. Being right that nothing matters does not actually license the vat of acid, does not license the drunk massacre, does not license detonating your daughter's identity, and the story knows it, and it keeps proving it through the wreckage. Because here is the flaw in Rick's whole philosophy, the flaw exposed over and over. If nothing matters, then his own pain does not matter either, and yet he acts, constantly, as if his pain is the one fact that outweighs everything else in the universe, the thing that entitles him to burn everything else down. He cannot have it both ways. He cannot say nothing matters and then organize all of infinity around his own grief. The nihilism is selective, and a selective nihilism is not a philosophy, it is an excuse. Rick believes nothing matters except the things that hurt Rick, and that is not the cold, clear truth of an enlightened mind. That is the oldest and most human self-centeredness there is, dressed up in the language of physics. The smartest man in the universe built a worldview whose only real conclusion is that he gets to do whatever he wants, and a worldview like that, no matter how many equations you hang on it, is just selfishness with a bigger vocabulary. Here is the uncomfortable question that any honest version of this has to face, and I have been circling it for a while, so let us walk straight into it. If Rick is all these things, a planet killer, a child user, a drunk murderer, a manipulator of his own family, then why do we love him? Why is he one of the best-loved characters on television? Why do people put him on their walls and their mugs and their skin? Why do you, keep watching a man do these things for 8 seasons and come back wanting more? And the answer is not that we are all secretly monsters. The answer is more interesting and more damning than that. We love Rick because the writing is very carefully making us complicit, and that complicity is part of what it wants to teach us. Start with the simple fact that Rick is a joy to watch. He is funny. He is the cleverest person in every room, and he knows it, and you get to enjoy that superiority alongside him. Get to feel, for 22 minutes, what it would be like to see through everything and answer to no one, and always have the perfect cutting line. That is a genuine pleasure, and the show does not pretend otherwise. When Rick eviscerates some pompous authority figure, when he waves away a rule everyone else is scared of, when he solves in 3 seconds a problem that was supposed to be impossible, you feel a lift, a vicarious thrill, the fantasy of being unbound. Every one of us has been small in a world that felt too big and too stupid, and too full of people telling us no, and Rick is the answer to that smallness. He is what you would be if you were never afraid again. And who would not want for a moment to be that? But watch what the show does with that thrill, because this is the trick, and it is a moral trick, not just a narrative one. It gives you the pleasure first, gets you laughing, gets you rooting, gets you invested in Rick winning, and then, a beat later, it shows you the cost of the win. You cheer when drunk Rick takes down Worldender that the heroes could not, and then you see the corpses in the death traps. You laugh at Rick escaping the vat of acid, and then you learn about the graveyard of Mortys that escape required. You are handed the candy and then, once it is already in your mouth, told what is in it. And in that moment, that small lurch when the laugh curdles, you are meant to notice something about yourself, which is that you were enjoying it, that you were on his side, that his charm bought your loyalty before your conscience could catch up. That is not an accident. That is the show implicating you. It is teaching you, in the only way that actually teaches anyone anything, from the inside, how a monster gets away with it. A monster gets away with it by being charming, by being fun, by being the smartest and the coolest, by making you want him to win so badly that you look past the bodies. Rick gets away with everything for the same reason real charismatic people get away with everything, and you are made to feel the pull of it in your own chest so that you might recognize it next time in the real world. This is what I think elevates the whole enterprise above a nihilistic cartoon that just likes shocking you. The complicity has a purpose. If the show simply told you Rick was bad, you would nod and forget it. Instead, it makes you love him, makes you complicit in loving him, and then keeps showing you the receipts, so that the lesson is not a fact you learned, but a thing you felt happen inside your own reactions. You are not a neutral observer of Rick's villainy. You are a participant in it, an enabler, one more person charmed into looking the other way. And the show knows this, and is gently, relentlessly holding a mirror up to that too. The reason it is so hard to simply condemn Rick is the same reason it is so hard to condemn the charming, brilliant, damaged people we know in real life. And that difficulty is the actual subject of the whole thing. Not aliens, not portals. The way a sufficiently magnetic person can make an entire audience, an entire family, an entire universe, forgive the unforgivable, one great line at a time. And I want to give the counter case its full weight here, because a version of this that only prosecutes is not telling the truth about the show either, and Rick is not Rick Prime, and the difference matters enormously. For all the wreckage, our Rick is not incapable of love, and he is not incapable, on rare and costly occasions, of putting someone else ahead of himself. These moments are carefully planted, and they are what keep the character from tipping over into pure cartoon evil, and they are what make the villainy tragic instead of simple. The clearest of them comes at the end of the second season, and it is worth telling properly, because it is the strongest evidence for the defense, and a fair trial needs the strongest evidence for the defense. The episode is the second season finale, set at the wedding of Rick's oldest and closest friend. a being called Bird Person, one of the very few people in all of existence that Rick seems to truly, uncomplicatedly care about. The wedding should be a rare happy day, Rick surrounded by his ragtag crew, celebrating a friend, and it goes catastrophically wrong. The bride, Tammy, is revealed to be a deep cover agent of the Galactic Federation, the interstellar government that has been hunting Rick, and the whole wedding is a trap. In the chaos, Bird Person is gunned down, Rick's crew is scattered and hunted, and the family, Beth and Jerry and Summer and Morty, are now fugitives, unable to go home, their lives destroyed because of their association with Rick. It is, in a sense, the ultimate demonstration of the thesis of this whole video, Rick's presence in their lives, detonating everything around them once again. But then Rick does something he almost never does. He takes responsibility, and he pays for it himself. He gathers the family in a cold, hidden place, far from home, and he tells Morty a small lie to spare him, something gentle about going to get ice cream, and then he slips away and turns himself in to the Galactic Federation. He surrenders. He trades his own freedom for theirs, accepting imprisonment, likely forever, so that his daughter and his grandchildren can go home and have their lives back. There is no angle here, no scheme, no camouflage. For once, the great manipulator simply lowers his head and takes the punishment so that the people he loves can be free. He walks into a cell and lets the door close. It is the truest act of sacrifice he manages in the early run, and it is real, and any honest account of Rick has to hold it up next to the atrocities and let it complicate them. Now, I have to add the shadow that falls across even this, because the show adds it too, and it is characteristic. When we next meet Rick, at the start of the 3rd season, he breaks out of that prison with contemptuous ease, having apparently orchestrated large parts of his own capture and imprisonment as a long game to destroy the Federation from the inside. And the same episode ends with the causality monologue, where he reveals he engineered the family's divorce for his own benefit. So the sacrifice is real, and then it is immediately followed by manipulation, and you are refused any place to rest in either reading. Was the surrender at the wedding a genuine act of love, or was it the first move in a scheme, or was it both at once? A man capable of real sacrifice who cannot help also turning it to his advantage. The answer, I think, is both. Always both. And that is the truest thing said about him anywhere. Rick contains the capacity for genuine self-sacrifice and the compulsion to manipulate in the same body. And they are not in separate compartments. They are braided together so tightly that not even Rick could pull them apart. He can love you and use you in the same breath, and mean both, and that is exactly what makes him so dangerous to be loved by. We have talked about Rick harming his family, harming teammates, harming his grandson and his daughter, but there is one episode that scales his casual cruelty up past anything a family can contain, up to the level where the word villain stops being a metaphor and becomes almost a job description, and it does it in an almost offhand way, as a throwaway detail about his car. It is the 6th episode of the 2nd season, and it starts with a completely mundane problem. Rick's spaceship battery has died, and he needs to fix it. And to fix it, he has to go inside it, because the battery, it turns out, is not a battery at all in the way you would think. It is a universe. Let me lay out what Rick actually built here, because the more you understand it, the worse it gets. To power his car, Rick created a miniature universe, a whole cosmos, complete with galaxies and planets and, crucially, life. Intelligent life. A civilization of thinking, feeling beings who are born and love and die and build a society, and who have no idea, none, that their entire universe exists inside a box under the hood of an old man's flying car. And Rick did not seed that universe with life by accident. He did it on purpose, because a universe with a thriving industrial civilization generates power, and Rick engineered these people, this whole species, to build a device they think is for their own benefit, a source of clean energy they have organized their society around, when in fact, every time they use it, they are generating electricity that gets siphoned straight up into Rick's car. They think they are running their world. They are running his battery, an entire sentient civilization, billions of lives across all of their history, exists for no reason other than to keep the lights on in Rick's vehicle, and they will never know it, and Rick has never lost a moment of sleep over it. That alone would be among the darkest premises the show ever committed to. A man who casually invented and enslaved a universe as a household appliance. But the episode goes further, and where it goes turns it from horror into something closer to philosophy. When Rick travels down into his battery universe to find out why his power is failing, he discovers the reason, and the reason is that one of the beings he created, a brilliant scientist, has figured out the same trick Rick did. This scientist has invented his own miniature universe, his own box full of life, to power his own world, which is why he stopped needing Rick's power source, which is why Rick's battery went dead. Rick, the god of this universe, has been outgodded by one of his own creations, who is now doing to a smaller universe exactly what Rick did to his. And there is a hint that it goes down another level again. A universe inside the universe, inside the universe. Exploitation, all the way down. A fractal of gods enslaving worlds to power their cars. The confrontation between Rick and this scientist is one of the sharpest things the writers have ever done, because the scientist is not a fool, and he is not wrong. When Rick tries to shame him for enslaving a universe, the scientist simply points out that Rick did exactly the same thing, that Rick is standing in a universe he enslaved lecturing a man for enslaving a universe. They are the same. They are two versions of the identical crime, and the only difference between them is scale. Which world happens to be bigger, which one is the appliance, and which one is the man. And Rick has no real answer to this, because there is no answer, because the scientist is right, and Rick's only advantage is that he was higher up the ladder to begin with. It is the whole show in miniature, the same idea we keep circling, that the difference between Rick and the villains is never a difference of kind, only a difference of position. Rick is not better than the man enslaving a universe to power his world. Rick is just the one whose universe is on top. What stays with me about this episode is not even the enslaved civilization, horrifying as that is. It is how little Rick thinks about it. This is not a scheme he is proud of or a crime he agonizes over. It is his car battery. It is a piece of maintenance, an errand, a thing he has to go fix because it is inconvenient, the way you or I might go jiggle a loose wire. He created and doomed an entire cosmos of thinking beings and files the whole thing under automotive upkeep. And that, more than any single act of violence, might be the purest expression of what Rick is. A villain, in most stories, at least takes his villainy seriously. He wants something, he schemes, he cares about the outcome. Rick's worst crimes are the ones he does not even bother to think about, the ones so far beneath his notice that they have become infrastructure. He has so much power and so little regard for anyone smaller than himself that genocide can become a utility, suffering can become a battery, and he can drive around for years with a dying universe under the hood and never once feel the weight of it. That is a kind of evil the word evil almost fails to capture. Because evil implies attention, and Rick does not even attend. He just uses and moves on, and the universe screams silently in a box beneath his feet, while he complains that the car is running slow. For all the harm Rick does to the wider cosmos, the wound this show keeps coming back to is smaller and closer, and it lives inside the boy whose name is in the title. And there is an episode near the end of the 7th season that gets at it more precisely than any before it. And I want to be very careful in how I describe it, because it is exactly the kind of episode people misremember, and misremembering it gets the whole meaning backwards. It is the 7th season finale, and its premise is a fear pit. Rick and Morty end up at a strange location, a hole in the ground, near of all things a roadside diner, and the hole has a property. If you go into it, it shows you your deepest fear, forces you to confront the thing you are most afraid of, and only lets you climb out once you have faced it. Now here is where the care comes in, and here is the piece people get wrong, so let me be precise. A lot of people remember this as the episode where Rick jumps into the fear hole and has to confront his fear, and where we see a broken, gaunt, self-hating Rick, and a heartbreaking reunion with an image of Diane, his dead wife, brought back to face what he has become. Those images are in the episode. But they are not Rick's fear, And Rick is not the one whose mind we are inside. The entire sequence, the withered Rick, the ghost of Diane, all of it is a construction of Morty's imagination. It is Morty who is inside the whole, Morty's mind generating these pictures, and the reason his mind generates a Rick drowning in guilt and a Diane recoiling from the monster her husband became is that these are Morty's ideas about Rick, Morty's fears, not a documentary of Rick's soul. Rick himself does not take the plunge here in the way the retelling usually claims. This is Morty's episode, Morty's fear, and to understand it you have to ask what Morty is actually afraid of, because the answer is devastating, and it is the whole point. Morty's deepest fear, the thing the whole digs down to, is not monsters or death or losing Rick. Morty's deepest fear is that he is replaceable. That is the thing that scares him more than anything in the universe. The possibility that to Rick he is not special, not irreplaceable, not loved for himself, but simply the current Morty, one interchangeable grandson in an infinite supply of grandsons, a part that can be swapped out the moment it wears down. And when you connect that to everything we have already talked about, the shield, the brainwave camouflage, the human armor line, the fact that Rick has moved between families and replaced dead versions of people without blinking, you realize that Morty's fear is not paranoid. It is accurate. He has spent his whole life with a man who really does treat people as versions, as swappable, as instances of a type rather than singular souls. And some part of Morty has always known this, and the whole just drags it up into the light. The scariest thing in Morty's world is the quiet suspicion that the grandfather he loves could get a new Morty tomorrow and barely notice the difference. And he has been given every reason to suspect exactly that. So why does Morty's mind, given free rein to imagine anything, conjure a Rick consumed by guilt and self-loathing, and a Diane who looks at that Rick in horror? I think it is because that is Morty's hope smuggled inside his fear. If Rick really is that haunted, that broken, that full of buried remorse, then Rick is a man who feels things deeply, a man capable of guilt, and a man capable of guilt is a man who could, in theory, actually love a specific grandson rather than a replaceable one. Morty's imagined Rick, the gaunt, guilty one, is Morty trying to believe that under all the coldness there is a person who would grieve if Morty were gone. The fear is that he is replaceable. The wish, hidden inside the fear, is that he is not. That Rick's numbness is a cover over a real heart that would break. And the writing, characteristically, does not fully confirm or deny it. It just shows you the boy reaching, in his most frightened moment, for the belief that his grandfather's love is real and specific and unswappable, and it lets you feel how badly he needs that to be true, and how little the actual Rick has ever done to reassure him of it. That, to me, is a more damning portrait of Rick than any planet he ruined, because it is about what he has done to the inside of a child. Rick has raised a boy whose deepest, bedrock fear is that the person he loves most does not really see him. Think about what a life has to look like for that to become your core terror. Think about how many times a grandfather has to treat a boy as a tool, as backup, as a means to an end, for the boy to internalize, at the very bottom of himself, the conviction that he is disposable. That is not a fear that comes from nowhere. It is a fear Rick built, one careless act at a time, one you are just a shield at a time, one moving to a new dimension and burying the old Morty at a time. Morty is afraid of being replaceable because Rick has spent years teaching him, without ever meaning to give the lesson, that in Rick's universe, everyone is. The villain of this show does not only leave bodies. He leaves a boy who cannot quite believe he is loved, and that may be the deepest damage of all, because it does not end when the credits roll. It goes home with Morty. It becomes who Morty is. And there is a bitter irony sitting underneath the whole episode, which is that the image Morty's mind produces, the guilty, haunted Rick facing a horrified Diane, is also the show's own thesis about Rick delivered through a side door. Even in a fantasy generated by a frightened teenager, the only Rick anyone can imagine is a man crushed by what he has done. Morty cannot picture a happy Rick, a peaceful Rick, a Rick at rest. When his imagination reaches for his grandfather, what it finds is a wreck haunted by a woman who cannot forgive him. That is how thoroughly the villainy has soaked into the character, that even the people who love him, when they close their eyes and picture his inner life, see a monster looking back at his own reflection with despair. Morty's hope and Morty's fear are the same picture, and the picture is of a guilty man. That is what it is to love Rick Sanchez. Your deepest wish and your deepest fear turn out to be the same image, and the image is of ruin. All of which leads to the question the recent seasons have been forced to ask, the one that becomes unavoidable once Rick finally kills Rick Prime and settles the score that defined his whole existence. The question is simple to state and almost impossible for Rick to answer. Who is he now? For decades of in-story time, and for the entire run-up to that point, Rick had a shape, even if he pretended he did not, even if he insisted nothing mattered. Underneath the drinking and the nihilism and the adventures, there was a spine, a purpose, a man hunting the thing that killed his wife. It gave his misery a direction. It let him tell himself, in the private place where even Rick keeps his real reasons, that all the damage was in service of something, that he was not just a drunk destroying everything he touched, but an avenger on a long, cold road toward justice. And then the road ends. He gets to the end of it. He kills the man, and the purpose that was holding the whole ruined structure of him upright is simply gone, and what is left is a man who has to look around and ask what all of it was for, now that the one thing it was supposedly for is finished. This is the trap of revenge that every good story about revenge eventually arrives at, and Rick and Morty arrives at it with unusual honesty. The problem with organizing your entire self around destroying one enemy is that the enemy becomes the central relationship in your life, the thing you are secretly closest to, and when you finally destroy him, you have destroyed the scaffolding of your own identity along with him. Rick without Rick Prime is not free, he is unmoored. The hatred was a kind of tether, and now it is cut, and he is floating. And the writing, to its credit, does not rush to fill the hole with a new mission or a tidy redemption. It lets Rick sit in the emptiness of having gotten what he wanted, which is one of the loneliest feelings a person can have, because you cannot even tell yourself the story that you would be happy if only you had it. You had it. You have it. And you are still this. That is where the newer seasons find him, the 8th season having aired across the middle of 2025, with the show now continuing under new voices. Rick and Morty, performed by different actors than the man who created and first voiced them, the series carrying on the way it always said people carry on, by replacement, by moving forward, by refusing to stop. And thematically, it has turned its attention to exactly the thing the whole premise had been avoiding for years, which is the possibility of change. Because here is the thing about a villain who has run out of reasons to be a villain. He is, for the first time, actually free to choose. As long as Rick Prime was alive, Rick could always say he had no choice, that the hunt required him to be hard, that healing was a luxury a man on a mission could not afford. That excuse is dead now, buried with the man he beat to death. And so the question that has been implicit since the very first episode finally becomes explicit. Not can Rick change, but will he? Now that nothing external is stopping him, now that the only thing keeping him a monster is his own preference for being one. I do not think the show has answered that yet, and I do not think it is in a hurry to, and I actually respect that enormously, because the honest answer to whether a person like Rick can change is that it is truly uncertain, and any story that resolved it cleanly in one direction would be lying. What the recent seasons keep dramatizing is Rick at the edge of the choice, circling it, approaching the possibility of being a person and then flinching away from it, because being well would mean grieving properly, and grieving properly would mean feeling the full size of the loss of Diane without the anesthetic of a mission to numb it. And that is the one thing this man has spent his entire life running from. The revenge was, among other things, a way of not grieving. As long as he was hunting the killer, he never had to just sit in a room and feel that his wife and his baby were gone and were never coming back, and that no amount of genius could fix it. Now the hunting is over, and the grief is still there, exactly where he left it, waiting, and the whole drama of late-period Rick is whether he will finally turn and face it, or find some new mission, some new enemy, some new bottle to keep running. And this is where the doubled meaning we started with comes all the way home. Rick is the villain of the story that happens to his family. Yes, the wrecking ball, the manipulator, the man who ruins everyone he loves. But he is even more completely the villain of the story that happens to himself, because he is the one holding himself hostage. There is no Rick Prime left to blame. There is no Galactic Federation, no Citadel, no external force stopping Rick from putting down the bottle and sitting in Dr. Wong's chair and doing the boring, unglamorous human work of getting better. The only thing standing between Rick and a recovered life is Rick, his pride, his fear, his conviction that a mind like his is too important to submit to something as ordinary as healing. He is his own jailer, and he has the key, and he has always had the key, and he will not turn it, because turning it would mean becoming a smaller and quieter and more ordinary man, and he would still rather be a magnificent ruin than a healed nobody. That is the choice the whole series has been walking toward, and the reason it is such a powerful piece of storytelling is that it refuses to make the choice for him, and it refuses to pretend the choice is easy, and it leaves him, and us, standing right at the edge of it, waiting to see which way a broken genius will fall when he finally has no one left to blame but himself. Whether the show ever lets him choose to heal, I cannot tell you, because it has not happened yet, and I will not invent an ending the series has not written. What I can tell you is that the question itself is the most human thing in a show that spends most of its time among aliens and portals and infinite versions of everyone. Underneath the whole cosmic apparatus, Rick and Morty is asking whether a person who has spent his life being the villain, and who knows he is the villain, and who has run out of excuses for it, can ever decide to stop. That is not a science fiction question. That is the oldest question there is about any of us. And the show has the nerve to ask it about the man it named itself after, and to leave the answer wide open, and to trust that we will keep watching not to see Rick win, but to see whether he will finally choose to be good, or choose, one more time, the ruin he has always preferred. There is a piece of the show's own origin that sharpens this whole argument, and it is worth telling, because it reveals that Rick was designed from the very beginning as a corruption of a beloved idea. Before Rick and Morty was a series, it began as a crude little parody short made by Justin Roiland, a rough animated sketch built to mock the relationship at the center of a certain famous time travel movie. The dynamic between a brilliant, eccentric old scientist and the wide-eyed teenage boy he drags on adventures. That archetype, the lovable mad genius and his young sidekick, is one of the warmest and most familiar in all of popular storytelling. The old man is a little unhinged but fundamentally kind. The boy is in over his head, but safe. And the whole thing runs on the comforting fantasy that this strange, brilliant grandfather figure would never really let the kid come to harm. It is a fantasy about being taken care of by someone extraordinary. And Rick and Morty took that fantasy, and it asked a single, poisonous question. What if he would let the kid come to harm? What if the brilliant old man were not kind? What if the fantasy of the magical grandfather were actually a nightmare, and we had just never looked closely enough to see it? That is the engine underneath the entire series, and once you know where the characters came from, you can see it running in every episode. Rick and Morty is a systematic dismantling of the mad scientist and boy archetype, a demonstration of what that relationship would really look like if the scientist were as brilliant as the archetype promises, but also as amoral as that much intelligence, unchecked by any consequence, would probably make a person. The warm version of this story asks you to trust the old man. Rick and Morty asks you why you ever trusted him, why an audience will hand its affection to any sufficiently clever, sufficiently confident older man, and simply assume he has the boy's best interests at heart. The archetype is weaponized against you. You come in expecting the kind genius, because you have seen that character 100 times, and the show uses that expectation to sneak a monster past your defenses, and then slowly, over seasons, it lets you see what you actually invited into your living room. And this is why I think the villain reading is not a cynical misreading of a fun cartoon, but the actual design intent baked in from the parody short onward. Rick was never meant to be the kind grandfather. He was conceived, from his very first appearance, as the dark answer to the kind grandfather, the reveal of the horror the comforting archetype was always papering over. The genius of the show is that it does not present this as a twist. It does not spend 2 seasons pretending Rick is nice and then unveil that he is bad. It shows you the badness from the first episode, right there in the open, the drinking and the recklessness and the endangerment of a child, and it simply trusts that your affection for the archetype will make you forgive it, make you file it under lovable rogue, make you laugh, and that is the same complicity we talked about before, working at the level of the entire genre. You forgive Rick because you have been trained by 100 kinder stories to forgive the mad scientist grandpa, and Rick and Morty is the story that finally makes you pay for that reflex, that shows you the bill for a lifetime of assuming the brilliant old man is safe. In other words, the show is not just about a villain, it is about our willingness to overlook a villain when he comes dressed as a beloved type. It took the coziest, warmest version of the genius and boy story, and it revealed the abyss that was always underneath it. The fact that a genius who answers to no one and cares for nothing is not a wacky sidekick to childhood, but a danger to it, and that the only reason we ever found the archetype comforting is that the stories were kind enough to keep the genius kind. Strip the kindness away, keep everything else, and you get Rick, and Rick is what the mad scientist grandfather always could have been if a writer were brave enough or bleak enough to follow the premise to its honest end. That is a remarkable thing for a comedy to be doing under all the fart jokes and the portal guns, and it is why the show rewards being taken seriously. It is a horror story about a beloved archetype, told as a comedy, and the horror is that we love the monster anyway, exactly as we were always going to. There is one more shape to Rick's villainy I want to draw out before we close, and it is the loneliest one, because it is the pattern that runs through every relationship in his life, and it is the clearest sign the damage really does originate in him. Everyone leaves Rick. Every deep connection he has ends in loss, and if you look closely at how each one ends, the losses are almost never simply done to him. He engineers them, or he earns them, or he drives them away, and then he stands in the wreckage of another abandoned relationship and tells himself the same story he always tells himself. That connection is a weakness, and he was right to expect it to fail. Think about the pattern. Diane, the wife, was taken, and that one was truly not his fault. That was Rick Prime, and it is the wound at the root of all the others. But watch what he does with every relationship after her. Unity, the hive mind, the being he reconnects with in that second season episode, does not just drift away from him. It flees him, and it tells him why. That being near Rick makes it want to be less than it is. That his gravity pulls everything down. That it has to escape him to survive. Unity looks at Rick clearly and runs. And it is not cruel. It is self-preservation. Bird Person, the closest friend Rick has in all of existence, is destroyed at that wedding. And while the trigger was pulled by the Federation, the wedding was a disaster that trailed Rick's whole life of enemies into a room full of the people he loved. And Bird Person, rebuilt afterward as a cyborg thing, spends much of what remains of his story estranged from Rick, carrying grievances against the man who was supposed to be his brother. Even Rick's oldest friendship curdles into something wounded and unresolved. And then there is the boy who got smart, Evil Morty, who did not want to defeat Rick or replace Rick or rule the world. He just wanted to get away from Rick, from all the Ricks, from a universe organized around Rick's supremacy, and he burned down an entire civilization to do it. Escaping Rick was worth genocide to him. That is what it cost to leave a Rick, and that is how badly one Morty wanted out. Look at the list. Diane taken, Unity fleeing to save itself, Bird Person lost and then estranged, Evil Morty escaping over a wall. His own daughter offered a clone so she could fly away. His grandson lying awake terrified that he is replaceable and secretly hoping he is loved. The through line of Rick's entire emotional life is departure. People do not stay near Rick, and the ones who cannot leave are the ones he has trapped. And a man could look at that pattern and conclude that the universe is cruel and connection is a lie and everyone abandons everyone in the end, which is exactly what Rick concludes. Or a man could notice that he is the common element in every single one of those endings, the one thing all those broken relationships have in common, and concludes something much harder to live with. Rick chose the first reading. The show, gently, keeps offering him the second, and he keeps refusing to read it, because the second reading would mean the loneliness is not the universe's verdict on life. It is the universe's verdict on him. So let us finally weigh it, now that all the evidence is on the table, and let us try to be precise about the word, because precision is the difference between a real argument and a hot take. Is Rick actually a villain, or is that just a provocative way of saying he is a flawed anti-hero like a dozen other difficult men on prestige television? I think the distinction matters, and I think Rick lands in a stranger and more specific place than either simple label, and getting that place right is the whole reward of thinking this hard about a cartoon. Start with why he is not an anti-hero, at least not in the usual sense, because that is the comfortable box people want to put him in, and it does not quite fit. An anti-hero, in the way we normally use the word, is a person who does bad things in service of something we ultimately recognize as good, or at least understandable. The gruff cop who breaks the rules to catch the killer. The criminal with a code who only hurts people who had it coming. The anti-hero violates our morality but honors our values underneath. And by the end, we are meant to feel that the good he served outweighed the harm he did along the way. Rick does not pass that test. When you actually tally what Rick's harm is in service of, the answer is almost never something good. It is in service of his pride, his convenience, his need to win an argument, his refusal to feel his grief, his desire to be the biggest and most important thing in every room. The vat of acid was for his ego. The Vindicators died for his contempt. The universe in his battery powers his car. Rick does not do bad things for good reasons. He does bad things for the reasons a selfish, wounded, godlike man does bad things, which is that he wanted to and nothing stopped him. That is not an anti-hero. That is closer to the real thing. But he is not a pure villain either, and here is where the honesty has to cut the other way. Because a pure villain is a simpler creature than Rick. A pure villain does not suffer the way Rick suffers. A pure villain does not build a machine to kill himself in a dark garage. A pure villain does not have a Diane, does not have a wound, the whole edifice of his cruelty is built to avoid feeling, does not lie awake somewhere inside himself knowing exactly what he is and hating it. Rick Prime is a pure villain. Rick Prime killed and moved on, and felt nothing, and wanted nothing, and that emptiness was total. Our Rick is not that, and the whole show is the distance between our Rick and Rick Prime, a distance made entirely of pain. Our Rick is a villain who is also his own first and worst victim, a man who did the worst damage to himself, who is imprisoned by his own hand, who could be free and will not be. And that is the third thing, the thing that is neither anti-hero nor simple villain. It is a villain who is also a tragedy, a monster who is also the monster's most abused creation, a man playing both the torturer and the tortured in a story with only one real character in it. That, I think, is the honest verdict, and it is why the title of this whole video is true in a deeper way than it might first sound. Rick is the villain of his own show, and the phrase his own show is doing double work. It is his show in the sense that the series is named after him and follows him and is shaped by his choices, and he is the villain of that show, the primary source of suffering in it. But it is also his own show in the sense that his life is a show he is running, a performance of nihilism and genius and invulnerability that he stages for himself and for everyone around him, a story he tells about a man too smart and too enlightened to be held to ordinary rules. And he is the villain of that show too, the one who wrote it. The one who cast himself as the misunderstood God when he is actually just the perpetrator. The one who keeps the whole production running so that he never has to walk off stage and be an ordinary grieving man in an ordinary quiet room. He is the villain of the show the world watches, and he is the villain of the show he performs for himself, and the second one is the one that is killing him. And the thing I keep landing on, the thing that makes this more than an exercise in prosecuting a fictional character, is that the story never lets the verdict become an excuse to stop caring about him. This is the hardest and best thing about it. You can hold everything we have said tonight, every atrocity, every manipulation, every ruined life and enslaved universe and terrified grandchild, and you can still feel the pull of him, still hope, against all the evidence, that he turns the key in his own cell and walks out into some kind of peace. The show earns that hope without ever pretending he deserves it, and that tension, between knowing what he is and wanting him to be better, is the truest thing the series has to say about loving anyone difficult. We do not love people because they pass the moral audit. We love them across the failing of it, and Rick is the enormous, cosmic, painful demonstration of exactly how that works, and exactly what it costs. There is a bigger idea underneath all of this, one that I think explains why Rick and Morty struck the nerve it struck, and why this particular character became such a fixture of the culture, and it is worth ending the body of our case on it, because it lifts Rick out of the cartoon and holds him up as a kind of experiment about all of us. Strip away the science fiction and ask what Rick actually is, at the level of design, and the answer is that Rick is a controlled experiment with one variable removed. The variable is consequences. Rick is a person from whom the universe has removed all accountability. He cannot be caught, because he can portal away. He cannot be truly stopped, because he is smarter than everything. He cannot even be permanently killed, because there are infinite versions of him, and he has cheated death more than once. Rick is what you get when you take a human being and delete, entirely, the thing that keeps the rest of us in line, which is that our actions come back to us, that we answer for what we do. And nowhere is that deletion clearer than in the way Rick relates to death itself, because he has arranged his life so that death, the one consequence no one is supposed to be able to escape, does not really apply to him the way it applies to everyone else. Across the series, he keeps contingencies, backups, ways out. When a version of him dies, there is often another version, or a plan, or a body in reserve, and this is played with often enough that you stop expecting Rick's death to mean anything, because he has made his own mortality negotiable in a way no one around him can. Meanwhile, the people near him die permanently, ordinarily, for real. Bird Person took a bullet that could not be taken back. The Mortys who die to power a reload do not come back. The universe in his battery cannot restart. Death is a wall for everyone in Rick's orbit, and a door for Rick, and that asymmetry is the deepest form of his impunity. Because a man who can always find a way to survive is a man who has effectively exempted himself from the one condition that makes the rest of us take life seriously. When you know you might not really die, other people's deaths get very cheap very fast. Think about what that does to a conscience over time. Every human moral instinct we have is shaped, somewhere down at the root, by the knowledge that we are mortal, and so is everyone else, that the harm we do cannot be undone, and the people we lose do not come back, that the clock is real, and it is running for all of us at once. Rick has, through sheer genius, loosened his own grip on that shared condition. He treats his life as a thing with save points and spare copies, and once you treat your own death as reversible, it becomes nearly impossible to feel the full weight of anyone else's, because the finality that makes death matter has stopped being a fact about your own existence. Rick is not just a man without consequences for what he does. He is a man who has partly escaped the biggest consequence there is, and the cost of that escape, the thing he traded away without noticing, is the ability to feel that any death, including the ones he causes, is a true and unrepeatable loss. He made himself hard to kill, and in doing so he made himself unable to grieve, and a man who cannot grieve is a man who can do almost anything. And the uncomfortable suggestion the show keeps making, the one that gives the whole thing its philosophical weight, is that consequences might be the only thing that was ever making any of us good. We like to think we are decent because of something inside us, a conscience, a set of values, a real moral core. Rick is the challenge to that flattering idea. Here is a man with a conscience, with values, with a wound that proves he once loved deeply. And watch what happens to all of that inner goodness the moment the external scaffolding of consequence is removed. It rots. It does not survive contact with true impunity. The love curdles into possessiveness. The grief hardens into cruelty. The genius that could have healed worlds spends itself on car batteries and revenge, because there is nothing outside him forcing him to be better, and it turns out that inside him, alone, was never enough. That is the truly frightening thing the show is proposing, gently, under all the jokes. That the reason most of us are not Rick is not that we are better than Rick. It is that we have never been given his freedom, never been handed a portal gun and an infinite multiverse, and a guarantee that nothing we do will ever come back to hurt us. We stay good because we have to. Rick shows you what is left when you do not have to anymore, and it is not pretty. And the reason it lands so hard is the fear, way down, that he might be right about us, that the only thing standing between any decent person and Rick Sanchez is a set of consequences we did not choose and cannot escape, and secretly, on our worst days, resent. There is one last consequence of Rick's villainy that I think is the darkest of all. Darker than the enslaved universe. Darker than the drunk massacre. And it is the one the show has been building in slow motion the entire time. So slowly that it is easy to miss until you look back across all the seasons at once. It is what happens to Morty. Not what Rick does to Morty, which we have covered, the shield and the fear and the trauma. It is what Rick is turning Morty into. Because a villain's worst legacy is never just the damage he does in his own lifetime. It is the successor he leaves behind, the person he shapes to carry the sickness forward after he is gone. And the show has been showing you, slowly and steadily, that Morty is becoming Rick. Go back to the beginning of the series and remember who Morty was. He was soft. He was frightened and kind and moral in the anxious, stammering way of a boy who has not yet been hardened by the world. In the early episodes, when Rick does something monstrous, Morty is horrified, and his horror is the audience's horror, the moral center of the show, the human reaction that keeps Rick's coldness in perspective. Morty is the one who insists that lives matter, that you cannot just do this to people, that there has to be another way. He is the conscience of the pairing, the small voice arguing for decency against a grandfather who has decided decency is a child's illusion. And then watch what happens to that boy over the seasons. Watch the horror wear down. Watch the stammering protests come less often. Watch Morty start to solve problems the way Rick solves problems, with violence, with cynicism, with a shrug at collateral damage that would have made the season 1 Morty sick. The implication, across the whole run, is that proximity to Rick is doing to Morty exactly what proximity to Rick does to everything, which is to grind down the softness and leave something harder and colder in its place. This is the deepest tragedy of the whole arrangement, because it means Rick is not just a villain who happens to have a grandson. He is a villain who is manufacturing another villain, one bad adventure at a time, one exposure to horror at a time, one lesson in impunity at a time. Every time Rick drags Morty into a situation where the only way out is to do something terrible, and they survive by doing the terrible thing, Morty learns that the terrible thing works, that Rick's way works, that the soft, frightened boy he used to be was wrong, and the hardened operator he is becoming is right. And the boy has no defense against this, because the person teaching him the lesson is the person he loves most and depends on for his life. You cannot spend your childhood as the apprentice of a man like Rick and come out the other side unchanged. The reading the show keeps offering is that Morty is being slowly overwritten, that the grandfather is, without ever quite intending it as a plan, remaking the grandson in his own image, and that the process is most of the way done before either of them notices. And here is the piece that turns it from sad into something colder, if you follow the logic of the show's own multiverse. We already know what a Morty looks like when he grows all the way up under the influence of a Rick and the injustice of that whole system. We have met him. He is Evil Morty. Evil Morty is what happens when a Morty gets smart and stops being the soft moral center and turns the coldness he learned back against the world that taught it to him. And the horror dangled, never confirmed but always implied, is that our Morty is on that same road, that the difference between the boy we follow and the boy who burned down the Citadel to escape is not a difference of kind, but a difference of how far along the path each one has walked. Every season, our Morty takes another step. Every season, he is a little more capable of the cold thing, a little less shocked by the monstrous thing, a little more like the man beside him. Rick may spend the whole series worried about external villains, about Rick Prime and the Federation and the Citadel, But the villain he is actually creating, the one that will outlive him and carry his damage into the future, is sitting in the passenger seat calling him Grandpa. That is the part of the show that unsettles me the most as it goes on, more than any single atrocity, because an atrocity is a moment, and this is a slow ruining of a whole person, a childhood being spent as raw material for another broken genius. And it reframes the entire villain question one final time. Rick is not just the villain of his own show in the sense that he causes the most harm. He is the villain in the deepest sense a person can be, which is that he is reproducing himself, passing the wound down the line, ensuring that when he is finally gone there will be another cold, brilliant, damaged Sanchez to take his place and do it all again. The greatest crime of the villain of this show may turn out to be the villain he leaves behind, and the boy never had a chance. Because you cannot ask a child to resist the gravity of the person who is supposed to protect him, and Rick's gravity, as Unity warned us all those seasons ago, pulls everything near it down. Before we soften toward the family, I want to name the single idea Rick has spread further than any weapon he ever built, because it is the most contagious thing about him, and it is the lie the whole show is steadily arguing against. Rick's real export is not the portal gun, it is the philosophy. It is the belief which he preaches constantly and lives completely, that nothing matters, that meaning is a childish invention, that in an infinite and indifferent universe, nobody is special, and nothing you do carries any weight. That is Rick's gospel, and the darkest measure of his influence is not the planets he ruined, but how thoroughly he has spread that gospel to the children in his care. You can hear it, chillingly, in the very first season, in an episode where Summer, the older grandchild, is having a crisis about her own existence after learning something upsetting about how she was conceived, and she threatens to run away. And Morty, her little brother, talks her out of it, and listen to how he does it. He tells her, in effect, that she should not worry about being an accident, because nobody exists on purpose, nobody belongs anywhere, and everybody is going to die, so she might as well come downstairs and watch television with him. That is the speech. That is the thing the younger brother says to comfort the older sister. And the reason he can say it with such calm, such strange peace, is that he has just been through the worst thing a person can go through. This is the same Morty who, a couple of episodes earlier, buried his own dead body in the backyard, who watched his entire world turn to monsters and then walked into a replacement world and dug a grave for himself. Morty learned the nihilism the hard way, in the dirt, at Rick's side, and now he is passing it down to his sister as if it were wisdom, as if it were a gift. This poison Rick fed him, repackaged as comfort. And the terrible thing is that in the moment it works, and it is even, in its way, a little bit beautiful. Two kids sitting down to watch television together, having decided that since nothing matters, they might as well not matter together. The show plays it tenderly. But step back from the tenderness and look at what has actually happened, which is that Rick's worldview has jumped a generation, has infected the grandchildren, has become the family religion. Rick did not just hurt these kids. He rewrote how they understand their own existence. He taught a teenage girl that her life is meaningless, and a teenage boy that meaninglessness is a source of comfort. And he did it not through any single cruel act, but through the slow radiation of simply being who he is, around impressionable people who love him. The nihilism is the inheritance. It is the thing he is leaving them instead of a healthy way to live, and they are absorbing it young, and it will shape every choice they make for the rest of their lives. But here is the rebuttal the show spends 8 seasons patiently making, and it is the reason I do not think Rick and Morty is actually a nihilistic show, whatever its reputation. It keeps proving Rick wrong. If nothing mattered, the death of Diane would not be the engine under everything. If nothing mattered, Rick would not have built a machine to kill himself when Unity left. If nothing mattered, the family's love would not keep pulling him back from the edge, and Morty's fear of being replaceable would not be the deepest thing in him, and evil Morty would not have burned down a civilization just to be free. Everything that drives every character in this show is a thing that matters to them enormously, and the writing knows this, and it keeps placing Rick's cold philosophy right next to the hot, desperate, meaning-soaked reality of the people around him, and it lets you see the contradiction. Rick says nothing matters, and then he acts, in every episode, as though his grief and his pride and his grandson are the most important things in all of infinity. The nihilism is not true even inside the show that preaches it. It is a lie Rick tells to survive his own pain, and the tragedy is that he told it so well and so often that his grandchildren believed him, and now they carry a falsehood about the emptiness of life that the show itself, in its bones, does not endorse. The proof that things matter is the show. You would not feel any of this if they did not. That is the deepest damage, in the end, deeper than any wound you can point to. Rick convinced the people who love him that love is meaningless, while spending his whole life proving, through his grief and his rage and his inability to let go, that it is the only thing that ever meant anything to him at all. He is a walking contradiction handed down to children as a creed, and untangling that creed, learning that Grandpa was wrong, that things do matter, that you are allowed to care, may be the hardest work Beth and Summer and Morty ever have to do, and Rick will not help them with it, because doing so would mean admitting the lie, and admitting the lie would mean feeling everything he has spent decades refusing to feel. I have spent this whole video building the case against Rick, and I stand by every piece of it, but there is a counterweight I do not want to leave out, because without it the picture is not honest, and it is the thing that keeps this from being a bleak little tract about a bad man, and makes it instead a story people love enough to watch for over a decade. The counterweight is the family, and the strange, stubborn, unaccountable fact that they stay. Beth stays, Summer stays, Morty stays. Jerry, pushed out and pulled back, stays. This family, which has every reason to run, which we watched be happier and safer without Rick in that ruined Cronenberg world, keeps choosing to keep him, keeps setting a place for him at the table, keeps loving the wrecking ball. And the show is not naive about why. Some of it is the wound he inflicted, Beth's need for the father who abandoned her. Some of it is dependence, the way a family organizes itself around its most powerful member. But some of it, and this is the part that redeems the whole enterprise, is simply love. The real thing, the unearned thing, the thing that persists past all the evidence. Because here is what the show understands about difficult people that most stories about difficult people miss. The love is not stupid. The family is not blind to what Rick is. Beth knows, Morty knows, better than anyone, the boy has cataloged every cruelty in his own body. Summer knows she is the overlooked one. They see him clearly, more clearly than the fans who want him to be cool, and they love him anyway, not because they are fooled, but because that is what love does. It attaches to a person, and it will not detach, just because the person fails the audit. And that persistent, clear-eyed, exhausted love is the one force in the entire multiverse Rick's genius cannot explain away, and cannot escape, and cannot fully corrupt. He can enslave a universe, and he cannot make his family stop loving him, and it drives him crazy, because it is the one piece of evidence against his whole philosophy he cannot refute. If nothing matters, why do they keep showing up? If everyone is replaceable, why does it hurt him when they are in danger? The family is the counterexample he lives inside and cannot argue with, and it is the reason there is a door out of his prison at all. And that is where the sliver of hope lives. The reason the show can keep asking whether Rick will change without the question feeling like a cruel joke. Rick is his own villain, his own jailer, the author of his own ruin. All of that is true. But he is also loved, past all reason, by people who see exactly what he is. And love that survives clear sight is the only thing strong enough to pull a man like Rick back from the edge he keeps standing on. Every time the show gives us a moment of Rick almost letting the wall down, almost saying the true thing to Morty, almost grieving instead of drinking, it is the family's stubborn love that created the opening. They are the reason the villain has a chance at not staying a villain. Not because they excuse him, because they refuse to leave, and a man cannot heal alone, and Rick, for all his infinite power, cannot do the one thing that would save him by himself. He needs them. A being this self-sufficient is, in the end, completely dependent on the people he keeps hurting, for the only thing that could ever make him better, which is a reason to want to be. So the final shape of it is not a man and his crimes. It is a man and his crimes, and the people who love him despite them, all bound together in a house that should not work, and somehow does, and the open question of whether the love will outlast the damage, or the damage will outlast the love. That is the real show, underneath the portals, and the aliens, and the infinite versions of everyone. It is a family holding on to a person who is bad for them because they cannot help it, and because, sometimes, in rare and precious moments, he shows them the love is not entirely wasted, that there is something in there worth staying for. A flicker of the man who once stood at the door of infinity and said no because he wanted to stay home. That man is still in there, under all the ruin. The whole tragedy is that Rick knows it too, and cannot forgive himself enough to let that man back out. Let me leave you with the thought that stays with me longest when the episodes are over and the house is quiet. Rick Sanchez could have been the hero. That is the thing. This is not a story about a man who was always going to be a monster. It is a story about a man who was, once, a person who chose love over power, who turned down the entire multiverse to stay with his wife and his daughter, and who had that choice punished in the cruelest way imaginable, and who then spent the rest of his life deciding that the punishment proved the choice was wrong. The villain of this show is a hero who gave up. He looked at a universe that took everything from him, and he concluded that the only sane response was to take everything back, to become powerful enough that nothing could ever hurt him again, and in making himself invulnerable, he made himself into the very thing that hurt him, another cold god leaving wreckage across the stars. The tragedy is not that Rick is evil. The tragedy is that Rick is a good man's ghost, haunting the ruins of the person he decided not to keep being. And every season, the show quietly asks him if he is ready to stop haunting and start living again, and every season so far, he finds one more reason to say no. That is Rick and Morty, underneath all of it. Not the smartest man in the universe, the saddest one. And a show brave enough to spend a decade telling you that its own hero was the villain all along, and to trust that you would love him anyway, and to hope, maybe, that in loving him you might understand something about the difficult, brilliant, wounded people in your own life, and about the parts of yourself that would do exactly what Rick did if the universe ever took the consequences away. Rick and Morty arrived looking like a crude little parody of a beloved old story, and it turned into one of the most honest portraits of a broken person that television has produced, honest enough to make the broken person its lead, and to name the show after him, and to spend season after season refusing to either redeem him cheaply or condemn him simply. It found the villain hiding inside the wacky grandfather archetype, and it dragged him into the light. And then it did the braver thing, which was to stay with him, to keep loving him, to keep the door open. A lesser show would have let Rick be cool. This one insisted he was dangerous, insisted he knew it, and insisted that knowing it and not changing was the truest villainy of all, worse than any monster. Because a monster cannot help what it is, and Rick can, and won't. And it wrapped that hard, adult idea inside a cartoon about a drunk scientist and his grandson, and it made millions of people laugh their way into a story about grief and accountability and the terrible freedom of having no one to answer to. That is a rare and difficult thing to pull off, and however the series ends, whenever it finally ends, that is what it will have been about. A man who could have been a hero, who chose to be a god instead, and the family who kept a light on for the person he used to be. So if you have been drifting off somewhere in the middle of all this, that is exactly as it should be, and I hope Rick and his long, sad, brilliant ruin made a gentle enough companion to carry you down into sleep. We covered a lot tonight, from a love potion that ended a world, to a garage in the dark, to a universe humming inside a car battery, to a boy afraid he is replaceable, and under every piece of it the same quiet argument, that the villain of this show has been the man at the center of it the whole time, and that the show has always known and always trusted you to know it too. And maybe that is the reason a story this dark can also be a comfort at the end of a long day. Because it never pretends people are simple, and it never asks you to hate the ones who fail, and it lets a monster be a father and a father be a monster, and holds them both without flinching. There is something restful in a story honest enough to do that. Honest enough to say that the people we love are complicated, and the people who hurt us are sometimes hurting worse, and that understanding a person is not the same as excusing them, and that you can hold all of it at once and still, somehow, keep the light on. Thank you for spending this time here in the quiet with me. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.